What if peace wasn't something you had to find, but something you had to remember? In a world full of noise, Zen Buddhism offers a soft whisper: slow down, breathe, and return to now. These Zen stories are like quiet lanterns in the dark small, gentle but full of light. In just a few moments, they can shift your thoughts, clear your emotions, and bring your mind back home. Let them guide you to a place where stillness speaks and serenity begins. Blind monk finds Zen in wind chimes. In the quiet hills beyond an ancient village, there lived a blind monk named Saji. Though he had never seen the world, his spirit was full of deep curiosity and longing. As a child, he had lost his sight in illness, and though many pitied him, Saji never once felt broken, only different. He entered a small Zen monastery where silence was treasured and words were few. But while the others meditated by gazing at trees and moonlight, Saji sat alone under the eaves, listening. Every morning, the wind passed through a set of delicate wind chimes that hung just outside the meditation hall. The other monks barely noticed them, but for Saji, these soft, dancing tones became his world. They were his sunrise, his still lake, his mirror. One morning, a young monk asked the master, "Why does Saji never join us inside? How can he meditate without sight?" The master replied, "Go and sit beside him. Listen." The young monk sat quietly next to Saji. At first, he heard only the breeze, then soft notes from the chimes, faint, irregular, like whispers from a dream. But after a while, those whispers grew louder in the heart than in the ear. They seemed to breathe with him, to echo something unspoken inside. Saji turned to him gently and said, "When I first heard these chimes, I wanted them to play longer. I wanted the wind to keep singing. But then I learned they do not come for me. They come and go on their own. I began to wait, to listen, and to accept. Slowly, I heard not just sound, but space, not just melody, but stillness. I learned that silence has shape. That peace is not something to see, but something to feel." The monk wept quietly. He had sat in silence for years, but he had never truly listened. Moral of the story: clarity is not about seeing, it's about sensing. The mind grows calm, not by force, but by surrender. When we let go of needing life to sound or look a certain way, we begin to hear the truth that lives beneath the noise. Like wind chimes, wisdom only speaks when we are still enough to hear. The next story is called Hidden Sutra Under a Collapsing Pine Temple. High in the misty mountains of a forgotten region stood an old pine temple, weathered by storms and time. Its wooden beams had begun to bend. The roof had started to sag. Few monks remained. Most had long since traveled to safer grounds. But one elder, Master Riku, chose to stay behind. He was nearly silent now, his days spent sweeping pine needles and watching the wind pass through the open walls. One day, a young traveler named Kiro arrived, seeking wisdom. He had walked for days and climbed for hours to reach the temple, only to find it falling apart. Confused, he asked the master why he hadn't saved it or left for a newer monastery. Riku only smiled and said, "Some things must fall apart before they can reveal their truth." The two sat in meditation for days beneath the cracking beams. One night, during a heavy storm, the largest pine on the hill cracked in two and fell onto the temple roof. Part of the structure gave way, and morning revealed shattered stone and dust where the main altar once stood. As Kiro helped clear the debris, he uncovered something strange beneath the broken floorboards: a small box, worn but intact. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, was an ancient sutra scroll. No one had known it was there. The writing was simple, almost childlike. It read, "Let go of the temple, let go of the body, let go of the mind. Nothing remains, and in that you are free." Kiro looked at the scroll and wept. Not from sadness, but from recognition. He understood now why the master had stayed. The collapsing temple had not been a tragedy, it had been a lesson. Master Riku said quietly, "What is hidden is only revealed when what we cling to is broken. We think we're losing something, but often it's only then that the truth rises from beneath." Moral of the story: sometimes things must fall apart to show us what's been hidden all along. We often search for wisdom in perfect places, yet it is in life's ruins that the deepest truths are found. Letting go of what is crumbling is not loss, it is the start of seeing clearly. The next story is called Master Paints, Storms to Teach Silence. In a quiet village by the sea, there lived a Zen master named Haku. He was not known for long talks or formal teachings. Instead, he painted. Day after day, he sat before blank rice paper, brush in hand, and painted storms, endless, wild, powerful storms. Great black clouds, crashing waves, lightning frozen in ink. Visitors came from far away, expecting peaceful landscapes or wise words. But all they found were his paintings, chaos, wind, and darkness. One day, a student named Nari asked, "Master, why do you always paint storms? Shouldn't Zen be about peace?" Haku looked up slowly and said, "You see storms, I see silence." Confused but curious, Nari stayed. Each day, she watched the master paint in silence. At first, she felt restless, waiting for explanations. But slowly, she began to notice things she hadn't before: the pause between brush strokes, the way Haku's breath matched the rhythm of the waves he painted, how the wind outside echoed through the ink. Over time, she no longer saw violence in the paintings. She saw stillness inside the movement. One evening, as rain pounded the roof and wind howled outside, Haku handed Nari a blank canvas and said, "Paint what you hear." She sat for hours, brush still. No image came. Finally, she closed her eyes. She let the storm pass through her. She breathed with it. And in that moment, she heard something deeper: a silence behind the thunder, a calm that held even the wildest gusts. She whispered, "The storm is not outside." Haku smiled. Moral of the story: peace is not the absence of noise, it is the stillness that holds all sound. Storms, like thoughts and emotions, may rage within us, but they do not define us. When we stop fighting the noise and listen deeply, we find the silence that never leaves. Just as a storm lives within the sky but cannot shake it, true calm holds steady beneath all things. The next story is called Mute Novice Learns from Moss. In the shaded corner of a quiet Zen monastery, where the sun rarely touched and the air stayed cool even in summer, soft moss grew in thick green blankets. It climbed over rocks, crawled along the wooden steps, and wrapped itself gently around the feet of old statues. Most monks walked past without noticing, but one novice, a mute boy named Toma, spent every day kneeling there, watching it. Toma had never spoken a word since birth. His silence was not by choice, but by nature. Some thought he would never learn the teachings of Zen without hearing the chants or asking questions. But the abbot, an old man named Shoji, simply said, "Let him learn the way water learns by touch, not talk." Toma began to care for the moss. He cleared leaves from it with his fingers, gently watered it when the air was dry, and sat for hours beside it. He began to notice its quiet pattern show. It grew more lush in the shadows, how it never forced its way upward but slowly, softly spread wherever it was allowed. It moved without needing to be seen. It thrived by surrendering to its surroundings, never asking for more than the moment. One morning, Shoji approached and sat beside Toma. He whispered, "What have you learned, little one?" Toma pressed his hand gently onto the moss, then placed that same hand over his heart. Shoji closed his eyes. Yes, that is enough. Though Toma could not speak, his understanding spoke louder than words. He had seen how the moss teaches not by shouting, not by rising high, but by staying soft, by growing slowly, quietly, steadily. The moss asked for nothing, yet it covered the world in peace. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always arrive through words. Some truths are learned in silence, through patient observation and quiet presence. Like moss, the soul thrives not by pushing, but by gently becoming part of the world around it. In stillness we grow, in softness we endure, and in silence we often hear the most. The next story is called Hermit Speaks Once Every 30 Years. High in the cliffs of a mist-covered valley, hidden by trees no road had ever touched, there lived a hermit named Gensei. No one knew his age. Some said he had been there for over 100 years. Others claimed he was a spirit, not a man. What was known, and written in temple scrolls, was that Gensei spoke only once every 30 years. Monks from all over the land traveled to that valley when the time neared, walking for days in silence and sleeping under the stars, just to be present for the moment of his speech. They would arrive with questions written on paper, fears hidden in their hearts, hoping to hear something that would change them. The hermit never announced the exact hour. He would sit on a large, flat stone beneath a tree twisted by centuries of wind. His hair was long and white like mountain frost, his robes made from coarse hemp, weathered and threadbare. He sat with perfect stillness, breathing with the earth. The crowd would wait, quiet, unmoving. And then, without signal, he would speak one single sentence. That was all. One year, after 3 decades of silence, Gensei looked up at the gathering of seekers and simply said, "A leaf falls," without asking why. Then he stood, bowed, and returned to his hut without another word. Some monks were confused, others frustrated, but a few wept, not because they understood immediately, but because something deep inside them did. The sentence echoed in their hearts, long after the journey home. One monk, many years later, said he remembered that line every time something in his life changed, when someone left, when he failed, when he didn't know what to do next. A leaf falls without asking why. It does not resist the wind, it does not argue with the tree, it lets go, and in that letting go, it fulfills its place in the world. Moral of the story: wisdom does not shout, it arrives like a whisper in the stillest hour. Truth, when heard at the right time, does not need to be explained. Like a falling leaf, peace comes when we stop clinging and allow life to move through us. Some answers are not given in words, but in timing. The next story is called Birdwatcher Awakens, Watching Crane's Reflection. Near a wide, still lake bordered by reeds and willows, an old man named Eita came every morning to watch birds. Once a traveling scholar, he had given up his books and lectures after a long illness and had chosen a simpler life, one of quiet, routine, and nature. Every day, he sat on the same stone at the edge of the lake, his eyes scanning the sky and trees for movement. But his favorite to watch was a solitary white crane that came just after sunrise, gliding across the water's surface before landing silently in the shallows. The crane never made a sound. It never looked toward Eita, but it always landed in the same spot, casting a perfect reflection in the still water. One morning, the air was cold, and the sky was heavy with clouds. Eita watched the crane land again and looked, as always, at its reflection. But this time something changed. A sudden wind rippled the water and the crane's reflection shattered. The bird remained pure and still, but its mirror self vanished into distortion. Eita froze. He realized he had been watching the reflection for years, not the bird itself. He had been chasing beauty in the image, the surface, the illusion. The real bird had always been there, breathing, moving, living, but he had paid more attention to its echo than its presence. Tears filled his eyes, not from sadness, but from awakening. He whispered, "I have lived in reflections." From that day on, Eta no longer focused on appearances, names, or meanings. He simply watched. He saw trees not as objects, but as breathing companions. He listened not for birdsong, but for the silence that came before it. The reflection had taught him the most powerful truth. That clarity begins when we stop chasing the surface. Moral of the story: we spend much of life watching reflections, what we think, what we expect, what we want things to mean. But real peace begins when we look beyond the image and meet the moment as it is. Like the crane, truth is silent, alive, and always just beneath the surface if we are still enough to see it. The next story is called Tea Ritual Dissolves Sorrow in Silence. In a quiet village wrapped in mist and cedar trees, there lived an elderly woman named Aya. She was not a monk nor a teacher, but people traveled great distances just to sit with her and drink tea. They came not for advice, but for a strange ritual she had practiced every morning for over 60 years, a silent tea ceremony said to ease even the heaviest sorrow. There were no signs, no prayers, no incense, just the warmth of her small wooden house, the sound of boiling water, and the scent of roasted tea leaves. Visitors would sit cross-legged on the floor. Aya would bow, then begin the ritual without words. Every motion was slow, thoughtful, the way her hand folded the cloth, how she poured the water in a gentle circle, the way the steam curled into the air like breath leaving the body. People often arrived with burdens too heavy to speak, grief from lost parents, regret over angry words, loneliness too deep for explanation, but in that space, nothing had to be said. No story needed to be told. She placed the cup in front of each guest with 2 hands, bowed again, and waited. The tea was always slightly bitter at first sip, then soft and earthy, like memory itself. The silence held everything, the sadness, the stillness, the small hope of healing. Once, a young man who had not spoken for weeks came to her with swollen eyes. He drank his tea and sat in silence for a long time. Before he left, he looked into Aya's eyes and said only, "Thank you for not asking me to explain." Aya smiled and touched her hand to her heart. That was the ritual's secret. She never asked anyone to speak, because sorrow, like tea, changes when held in warm hands and sipped slowly in silence. Moral of the story: healing does not always need words. In stillness, even sorrow begins to soften. When we make space for silence, we make space for understanding. Like tea steeping quietly in hot water, emotions transform when we stop stirring them. Sometimes, presence is the greatest comfort of all. The next story is called Child Monk. Follows moonlight into awakening. In a quiet monastery nestled between mountains and sky, there lived a child monk named Rin. He was only 10 years old, full of wonder, and often distracted by the shapes of clouds or the way light moved across stone. While the older monk sat in deep meditation, Rin would peek at the stars or chase dragonflies during walking practice. Some whispered that he was not ready for the discipline of Zen, but the abbot, a gentleman with silver eyebrows, simply said, "His path is not slower, only different." One night, unable to sleep, Rin slipped from his bedding and wandered into the courtyard. The moon hung low, large and golden, casting soft light across the temple roofs and gardens. Everything was silent, not a bird, not a breeze, only the hum of stillness. He followed the moonlight, step by step, barefoot across the stone floor. The light shimmered on the pond. It touched the edge of the meditation hall. It reached through the open gate that led to the forest. Without fear, without thinking, Rin walked toward it. As he moved deeper into the trees, The moonlight guided him along a narrow path. He didn't know where he was going, and yet he never felt lost. Eventually, he came to a small clearing. The moon sat directly above him, and the trees opened just enough for its light to pour down. Rin sat. Not because he was told to, not because it was practice time, but because something inside him softened. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, truly heard the silence. Not emptiness, but fullness. Not loneliness, but peace. He felt his breath, slow and even. He felt the earth beneath him, holding him without question. And there, in the arms of moonlight and night, the child found stillness without trying. In the morning, the monks found him asleep in the clearing, his face calm, his small body folded in meditation. The abbot only smiled and whispered, "The moon teaches too." Moral of the story: awakening does not always come from effort. Sometimes it arrives gently, like moonlight guiding us, not through answers, but through presence. When we stop trying to understand and simply follow what feels true, we return to the quiet place that has always been waiting within us. The next story is called Lost Path Reveals Itself When Forgotten. Long ago, in a dense forest where the trees grew thick and the sky barely reached the ground, there was said to be a hidden path that led to a temple of deep awakening. Many sought it. Scrolls spoke of it as a place where the mind became clear and the heart became light. But no one had found it for generations. A young monk named Riku, full of determination, set out to find the path. He carried maps, studied legends, questioned elders, and marked every tree he passed. Days turned to weeks. His feet were sore, his face scratched by branches, and still the path would not appear. He grew anxious, angry, lost. One morning, after waking to find even his map had blown away in the night wind, Riku sat beside a stream and wept. For the first time, he stopped looking. He stopped trying. He listened to the water, felt the wind on his skin, watched a bird dip into the river and fly off again. He laughed softly, without reason, and laid back on the moss, letting go of his quest. For the next few days, he wandered aimlessly, not as a seeker but as someone simply living. He ate berries without thinking of the temple. He bathed in cool ponds and watched leaves fall. The tension in his chest slowly loosened. His mind began to quiet. And then, one evening, as the last light of day poured golden between the trunks of the trees, he noticed a narrow trail beneath his feet so faint, it looked like it had been waiting in silence. He hadn't seen it before, even though he'd walked that same place 3 times. But now, without seeking, it was clear. He smiled, bowed to the earth, and stepped forward, no longer chasing, simply walking. Moral of the story: often, what we seek hides behind the act of seeking. The more tightly we chase peace, the more it slips away. But when we release our grip, when we stop striving and simply return to the present, the way reveals itself. The lost path is never truly lost, it only waits for stillness to make it seen. The next story is called Traveler Weeps Near a Silent Bell. Long ago, a weary traveler named Daigo arrived at a quiet hilltop temple after many days on foot. His clothes were torn by wind and rain, and his heart was heavier than the pack he carried. He had crossed forests and deserts, not for riches or glory, but to find peace from the grief that followed him like a shadow. He had lost his family to illness, and though years had passed, the ache never did. The monks welcomed him with warmth but few words. They pointed him toward the garden, where he could rest beneath a great wooden bell. This bell, Daigo was told, had not rung in over 100 years. No rope hung from it, no hands struck it, yet it remained standing, suspended between 2 ancient beams, like a mouth forever closed. That night, unable to sleep, Daigo wandered to the bell. The moon hung high, the air was cool and still. He stood beneath the bell, his hands trembling, unsure why he had come. "I've searched everywhere," he whispered, not to anyone in particular, "and I still carry this pain." The bell said nothing. Daigo sat down. He looked at the old iron, weathered by time. He imagined the sound it might have made long ago, deep, slow, shaking the ground. But now it was only stillness, emptiness, silence. And something in that silence broke him open. He wept not, loud or wild, but quietly, like rain sliding down leaves. The silence of the bell held him. It did not rush, it did not answer. It simply made space for his grief to be heard. When dawn touched the sky, Daigo felt lighter. The pain was still there, but it no longer crushed him. He bowed to the bell before returning to the path. He did not speak of his tears, and the monks did not ask. But they knew. The bell had done its work without a single sound. Moral of the story: not all healing comes from words or teachings. Sometimes the greatest comfort is found in the presence of something that simply listens. Like a silent bell, peace does not always ring. Out it holds space for what the heart carries, and in that quiet, we begin to let go. The next story is called Woman Weaves Spider Silk to Meditate. In a mountain village wrapped in mist, there lived a quiet woman named Emmy. She was neither monk nor teacher, yet her presence calmed even the most restless hearts. She spent her days gathering fallen branches, drying herbs, and weaving thread from the silk of spiders. The villagers often watched her with curiosity. She would sit for hours in stillness, waiting for the spiders to leave behind delicate threads along the garden stones. She never harmed them. She only took what was freely given, gently collecting each strand with fingers soft as breath. When asked why she did this, Emmy never gave an answer. Instead, she would smile and continue weaving thin, shimmering threads into patterns so fine they looked like air caught in light. One day, a grieving woman from the next valley came to visit. Her voice trembled, her eyes were tired from tears. She asked Emmy, "How do you stay so calm?" "I've tried to meditate, but my mind won't sit still. I feel like I'm breaking." Emmy said nothing. She handed the woman a wooden frame and motioned for her to sit beside her. Then, in silence, they began to weave. At first, the woman's hands shook. She broke the thread. She sighed, frustrated. Emmy simply nodded, encouraged her to try again and again. As the hours passed, the woman's breath began to slow. Her hands found rhythm, her thoughts quieted. She realized that every movement required patience, softness, and complete presence. There was no room for worry, no space for anger, only silk and breath and stillness. By evening, she looked down at the delicate pattern they had created, together a web of light and silence. Tears fell again, but this time they were soft. Emmy gently touched the woman's hand and whispered her only words of the day. "To weave silk, the spider must be still. To weave peace, so must we." Moral of the story: meditation is not only in still sit in it, lives in mindful hands and quiet acts. When we give full attention to the present, even the most fragile thread becomes strong. In patience, sorrow softens. In silence, we weave peace from even the thinnest strand. The next story is called Gardener Plants. Seeds never meant to grow. In a Zen temple hidden between the foothills and falling mists, there lived a monk known only as the gardener. No one remembered his real name. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were soft, like soil turned by hand. While others studied scriptures or sat in long meditation, he spent his days in the garden digging, planting, watering, and watching. But there was one strange thing the younger monks noticed. The gardener often planted seeds in places where they could never grow among rocks, beneath thick shade, even on dry stone paths where sunlight never reached. They whispered about it, puzzled. "Why waste effort on what won't bloom?" one asked. "He's old," another replied. "Maybe he's forgetting." One day, a curious novice approached him. "Master, why do you plant seeds where nothing will ever grow?" The gardener smiled gently and said nothing. He placed a small seed into the cracked stone beside them and pressed the soil with care. Then he whispered, "Not all planting is for harvest." The novice frowned. "But why plant at all?" The gardener looked at the boy and said, "Some seeds are for the earth, not the eye. Some are to teach patience. Some are for the hands that plant them to remember that effort without gain is still sacred." Seasons passed. The temple changed. The boy grew older. He became a monk, then a teacher. The gardener passed away quietly one spring morning, his hands still dirt-stained and gentle. Years later, a vine sprouted from the cracked stone where that seed had been placed. No one watered it. No one touched it. It grew slow and wild, wrapping itself along the path like a memory returning home. Those who saw it paused, not because it was beautiful, but because it wasn't supposed to be there. Moral of the story: not everything we do must bear fruit. Some acts are offerings to the present moment, planted not for results, but for remembrance. In a world that rushes for outcomes, quiet effort without expectation is a form of peace. True clarity grows when we learn to give, even when nothing comes back. The next story is called Warrior's Ghost Visits the Inwardly Still. In a remote forest where fog lingered between the trees like forgotten breath, there was an old shrine built on the edge of a battlefield, long turned to grass. Locals whispered that the spirit of a fallen warrior wandered there, appearing only to those whose hearts were truly silent. Many came to seek him, curious monks, wandering mystics, even proud soldiers. But they always left with nothing. The ghost, it was said, did not reveal himself to those who chased him. Years passed, and stories turned to legend. One day, a young monk named Keiji came to the forest, not in search of ghosts, but for solitude. He carried no sword, no scrolls, no wish for visions, only a bowl, a robe, and the desire to listen. He sat beneath the gnarled pine beside the shrine each morning and watched the light move across the moss. He swept the shrine floor, not because he hoped to be seen, but because it needed sweeping. He bowed to the wind. He made tea. He said nothing. On the seventh day, as dusk fell, the forest grew completely still. The birds quieted. The breeze stopped. Then, from the mist, a figure appeared, tall, armored in rusted steel, his eyes neither angry nor kind, but deeply knowing. The ghost of the warrior stood before Keiji and watched him in silence. Keiji did not flinch. He did not ask. He simply bowed. The ghost removed his helmet, revealing a long scar across his brow, and spoke in a voice like water running over stone. "I died in war, never knowing peace. I return only to those who carry it within." And just like that, the ghost vanished. Keiji never spoke of the vision. He didn't need to. Something in him had changed, his footsteps lighter, his gaze softer. He understood now that stillness is not emptiness. It is presence. It is peace so deep that even restless spirits find rest in its company. Moral of the story: true stillness draws even the unseen. When we stop seeking, proving, or performing, a quiet power awakens within us. Peace is not won, it is received, and those who carry it become lanterns in the dark, even to those long lost in shadow. The next story is called River Stones Used to Release Anger. At the edge of a small Zen village, a river ran clear and cold, winding gently through moss-covered rocks and tall cedar trees. Beside this river stood an old monk named Tetsu, known for his deep stillness and kind eyes. Though he rarely spoke of his past, The villagers whispered that he had once been a man of great Angira warrior whose fury burned through everything he touched. Now, he lived in silence, tending to the riverbank and teaching those who came in pain. One afternoon, a young man named Jiro arrived. His face was tight with rage, fists clenched, words sharp. "I can't control it," he said. "My anger comes fast. It ruins things. It ruins me." Tetsu led him without a word to the water's edge. He picked up a small, smooth stone and handed it to Jiro. "This," he said softly, "is your anger." Jiro looked at it, confused. "What do I do with it?" "Hold it, feel its weight, then throw it as far as you can." Jiro did. The stone sailed across the water and disappeared beneath the surface. The monk handed him another and another. Each time, Jiro named what had made him angry: his father's silence, his friend's betrayal, the injustice he had swallowed for years. With every stone, he threw his pain into the river, his breath growing slower, his shoulders softer. Eventually, he stood still, empty-handed. Tetsu knelt beside him and whispered, "The anger you carry is real, but it is not you. It is a stone, heavy when held, harmless when released." They stayed by the river until sunset, the sound of flowing water filling the spaces where silence used to hurt. From that day forward, Jiro returned whenever the anger rose. He would gather stones, feel their weight, name them, and let them go. Moral of the story: anger, like a stone, becomes heavier the longer we hold it. But when we name it, face it, and release it, it loses its grip. True clarity does not mean never feeling anger. It means learning how to let it pass without sinking us. The river does not hold the stones thrown into it, and neither must we. The next story is called Tree Chants in Rain, Known to Few. At the edge of a forgotten village stood a single ancient tree tall, twisted and older than memory. Its bark was silver gray, its leaves deep green with veins like river maps. Most villagers passed it by without thought. But on rainy days, when the sky darkened and the earth breathed, something strange happened. The tree began to sing. Not with a voice, but with a sound like a low hum carried in the falling rain, woven through the branches. It wasn't loud. You had to be still, completely still, to hear it. Only a few ever noticed. Most were too busy closing windows, rushing to shelter, or covering their ears from thunder. One boy, Kenji, barely 10, heard the sound while walking home one rainy evening. He stopped and turned. The sound was soft, but unmistakable, like a distant chant, full of sadness and wonder, both fading and blooming at once. He stood beneath the tree and listened. The rain soaked him through, but he didn't move. He didn't want to. Years passed. Kenji grew older. He returned often, always during storms. He never spoke of the sound. It felt sacred, private. Sometimes he brought others and asked them to wait in silence. But they would fidget, check the time, complain of cold, and they never heard it. One day, he asked the village elder, "Why do only a few hear the tree sing?" The old man smiled. "Because the tree does not sing to ears, it sings to attention." Kenji understood. He stopped trying to share the sound and began sharing stillness, instead teaching others to sit quietly, to listen without demand. Some heard nothing. A few wept without knowing why. The tree still stands. The rain still falls. And those who are truly present will sometimes hear the chant, a reminder that nature speaks not in noise, but in invitation. Moral of the story: the world whispers truth in every moment, but only to those quiet enough to receive it. Like the tree that chants in the rain, life's deepest wisdom doesn't shout, it waits. And when we stop running, stop talking, stop filling silence with ourselves, we finally hear what's been singing all along. The next story is called Not Untying Fisherman Finds Clarity. In a small coastal village, where morning fog clung to the sea like breath on glass, there lived a quiet fisherman named Haru. He was not known for speed or strength, but for the way he handled his nets with patience, with care. While others shouted across boats and cast their lines in haste, Haru moved slowly. He always returned late, often with fewer fish, but he never seemed bothered. His boat was old, his clothes plain, but there was one thing that set him apart each morning. Before sailing, he sat on the dock and untied a long, tangled rope from the day before. He never replaced it. He never cut it, just sat in silence, working through each stubborn knot with his bare hands. A young man named Kenta once asked, "Why don't you just get a new rope? That one's a mess." Haru smiled. "This rope is my mind," he said. "Every knot is a thought twisted in fear, anger, or confusion. I untie it to understand how it got that way." The boy laughed. "But it takes so long." Haru nodded. "So does peace." That day, the sea was rough. Most boats turned back early, but Haru stayed out, calm as always. When he returned, his nets were light, but his eyes were clear. He handed Kenta a small fish and said, "Better to catch one with peace than many with a stormed mind." Years passed. Haru grew older. One morning, he didn't go to sea. He sat with the rope one last time and untied a final knot. It was small, but tight, the kind made without noticing. When it came loose, he exhaled deeply, as if something heavy had left him. That evening, Haru passed quietly in his sleep. The rope lay beside him, unknotted, coiled like a resting wave. Moral of the story: our minds are full of hidden, not-sold fears, unspoken grief, tangled thoughts. We can't cut through them with force, but with patience and presence, we can loosen them, one by one. Clarity doesn't come quickly. It comes gently, through the quiet work of untangling what we've tied within. The next story is called Broken Bowl, Reflects the Still Mind. In a humble monastery near the sea, there was a tea bowl known by all the monks. It sat on a wooden shelf in the meditation hall, cracked down the middle, its glaze chipped and faded. Many wondered why it hadn't been replaced. New bowls were simple to make, but the abbot, Master Jorin, refused to remove it. He called it the mirror. Young monks would often ask about it, curious why such a broken thing was honored in a place of mindfulness and care. Master Jorin would only say, "When your mind is ready, it will show you." One morning, a restless novice named Daisuke, impatient with his slow progress in meditation, knocked the bowl from the shelf while cleaning. It hit the floor with a sharp sound and split further, a piece falling away. He froze, heart pounding. He expected scolding. Shame flushed through him. But Jorin walked in, knelt beside the bowl, and quietly picked up the pieces. He did not speak. He took out a small brush, dipped it in gold lacquer, and began to mend the bowl, piece by piece, in silence. Daisuke watched as the cracks became lines of gold. When the bowl was whole again, even more broken than before, Jorin handed it to him and said, "Hold this while you sit." That evening, Daisuke placed the bowl in his lap during meditation. At first, all he could see were the flaws. Then, slowly, he noticed how the gold shimmered with the candlelight, how the cracks held warmth, how the bowl didn't resist its damage, it embraced it. In his stillness, something within him softened. He realized that his mind, like the bowl, didn't need to be perfect to hold peace. The cracks weren't failures. They were the very places light entered. Moral of the story: stillness is not about being flawless, it's about being whole, even with what's broken. A quiet mind does not erase its scars. It accepts them, gently, with presence. Like a bowl mended with gold, the heart becomes most beautiful where it has been opened, broken, and lovingly restored. The next story is called Sutra Warns. Don't seek too hard. In a mist-covered temple tucked high in the mountains, there was an old scroll hidden deep within the library. Unlike the grand sutras studied by the monks full of verses, chants, and long commentaries, this one was different. It had no title, no decoration, and only a few lines written in simple ink. Many monks passed it by, thinking it unimportant. But one young seeker named Riku became obsessed with finding the final truth. He meditated longer than anyone, fasted often, asked endless questions, and scoured every page of every scripture. Still, peace evaded him. His mind was sharp, but always restless. The more he sought, the more distant the stillness became. One stormy evening, frustrated and exhausted, Riku wandered into the library to escape the wind. He pulled random scrolls from the shelf, no longer caring what they said. One fell open on his lap, the plain, forgotten sutra. Its ink was faded, but he could just make out the words. When you stop searching, you will find. When you stop grasping, you will know. The door opens when you no longer knock. Riku stared at the lines. He wanted to understand, but his mind kept reaching, spinning, asking, what did it mean? How could he stop seeking? Wouldn't that mean giving up? He read it again, then again. Finally, he closed his eyes and let the questions fall away, just for a moment. He stopped trying to understand, stopped trying to control, stopped trying to reach. And in that pause, something shifted. He felt stillness, not outside him, but within. It wasn't dramatic, it didn't shine. It was quiet and steady, like a deep breath he hadn't noticed he'd been holding his whole life. He stayed there, unmoving, as the storm outside calmed. From that day on, Riku no longer ran toward peace. He sat with it. He let it find him. Moral of the story: the more we chase peace, the more it slips through our fingers. True clarity isn't something to be captured. It appears when we stop demanding, stop striving, and allow the present moment to unfold. The deepest truths cannot be forced. They arrive when we are quiet enough to receive them. The next story is called Monk Sleeps in Dragon's Cave. Smiling. High in a jagged mountain range, there was a cave no one dared to enter. Legends said a dragon lived there, massive, ancient, and full of fire. Villagers told stories of bones near the entrance and smoke rising in the night. Even monks from nearby temples avoided it, saying the cave held a darkness too deep to face. But one spring morning, a wandering monk named Ren arrived. He was gentle, quiet, and carried only a staff and a faded robe. When he heard the dragon's stories, he simply bowed and said, "Then it is the perfect place to rest." The villagers warned him, begged him not to go. Ren only smiled. He climbed the mountain alone. The wind howled as the sun set, and still he walked calmly into the mouth of the cave. No one followed. All night they waited below, expecting smoke, fire, something. But the sky remained quiet. The stars watched. At dawn, the villagers saw him returning down the trail untouched, smiling, as peaceful as the sky behind him. One elder stepped forward and asked, "Did you not see the dragon?" Ren nodded. "Yes, I saw it." "And you were not afraid?" Ren paused, then said, "The dragon opened its mouth to burn me, but I did not run. I bowed, I closed my eyes, and I felt something strange, not fire, but warmth, not death, but grief. The dragon's roar was pain, not rage. So I laid down beside it, and we slept." The villagers were silent. Ren added softly, "Sometimes the things we fear most are only waiting to be seen without fear." He never spoke of the cave again, but those who spent time with him later said his presence felt like cool wind after a storm, as if he had touched something wild and returned with its peace. Moral of the story: fear grows in the places we avoid, But stillness can meet even the fiercest shadow with compassion. When we stop running from what scares us and sit with it gently, the fire often fades. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of peace beside it. The next story is called Vanishing Temple Appears When Not Searched For. There was once a legend spoken in low voices among monks and travelers alike of a hidden Zen temple deep within the forest, said to appear only to those who were not looking for it. Many had heard the stories. A temple of perfect stillness, where the mind cleared like the sky after rain. But no one could agree on where it stood. Some said it was in the mountains, others near a river. Some swore it floated above the trees like mist. Over the years, seekers came from far and wide. They brought maps, questions, and bright ambition. They walked miles, meditated under waterfalls, and chanted for hours. But no matter how long they searched, they found nothing. Only trees, only wind. The temple never showed itself to those who came demanding to see. One day, a woman named May wandered into the forest not in search of the temple, but to grieve. She had recently lost someone dear to her and carried no hope or plan. Only silence, only heaviness. She walked for days, stopping often to cry, to rest, or to simply sit beside rivers and watch the light move across the surface. One morning, while following a trail of fallen leaves, May came to a clearing she hadn't seen before. There stood a small wooden gate, moss-covered, quiet. Beyond it, a simple temple bathed in golden light. There was no sound but the rustle of trees and her own breath. She stepped inside. No one was there, but everything felt alive, peaceful in a way she couldn't explain. She knelt and wept, not from pain this time, but from relief. Not a word was spoken. Still, she understood. When she returned to the village, she tried to find her way back, but the path was gone. The trees had shifted, the gate had vanished. The temple could not be found. But something had changed in her. She no longer needed to search. Moral of the story: peace cannot be hunted or demanded. The more we search with force, the more it hides. True serenity appears when we stop chasing, when our hearts grow quiet, and when we surrender the need to arrive. What we seek often finds usually when we forget to seek. The next story is called Breathing Upside Down Clears Mental Noise. In a cliffside monastery where clouds floated beneath the windows, there was a strange practice known only to the innermost circle of monks. It was not taught to beginners, nor spoken of often. It was simply called the turning breath. A young monk named Hiro had trouble calming his mind. No matter how long he meditated, thoughts flooded in old memories, fears of failure, questions without end. He envied the others who sat in peace while he struggled to stay still. One day, after confessing his frustration, the head monk said only, "Go to the stone room, hang upside down, breathe." Confused but obedient, Hiro found the chamber carved into the cliffside. Ropes hung from beams. A mat lay beneath. Carefully, he tied himself in as instructed, legs secure, body inverted, head low, heart above. At first, the blood rushing to his head felt strange. His body protested. His mind screamed louder than ever before. But he was told to keep breathing, so he did. 1 breath. 2. 10. Then something shifted. The thoughts were still there, but softer, like voices behind a door. The usual direction of his focus had reversed. The questions lost their grip. In this upside-down world, everything slowed. His breath became steady, his mind weightless. He saw thoughts rise and fall like dust, no longer clinging to him. Tears filled his eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time, he wasn't fighting his mind. He was simply watching it float. When he returned upright, he bowed low to the earth, feeling more grounded than he ever had. That evening, the head monk said, Sometimes we must turn ourselves upside down to see what has always been beneath. Hiro nodded. The noise had not disappeared, but now he knew how to sit beside it, unmoved. Moral of the story: the mind is often loud because we keep approaching it the same way. Stillness sometimes requires a shift of body, of breath, of perspective. When we're willing to turn things upside down, we find silence, not by escaping thought, but by changing our relationship to it. Peace lives where resistance ends. The next story is called Mirror Shows Emotions, Not Faces. In a quiet temple nestled deep within a mountain pass, there hung a strange mirror in a narrow meditation room. It had no frame, no carvings, just a round surface that looked like silver water. The monks called it the Mirror of Heart, and only the abbot had the key to the room where it rested. It was not shown to visitors, nor used for decoration. It was a tool, they said, not for the eyes, but for the soul. One day, a young monk named Nao asked the abbot if he could see it. He was struggling with anger, and despite hours of zazen and strict practice, he could not quiet the storm inside him. The abbot looked at him kindly and said, "Come tomorrow at dawn, but do not look with your eyes alone." At sunrise, Nao stepped into the dim room. The mirror hung still and silent. He approached and looked into it, but he saw no face. There was no reflection, no outline of his eyes, mouth, or skin. Instead, the surface showed something else, shifting clouds of color, like breath painted in motion. Deep red swirled and pulsed like fire. It filled the mirror with movement, sharp and restless. Nao stepped back, startled. His chest tightened. "What is this?" he whispered. The abbot, standing at the door, replied, "It is your emotion, not your appearance. This mirror shows what you carry, not what you show." Nao sat on the floor and stared again. As his breathing slowed, the red softened. Hints of blue emerged, still, quiet, like a calm lake under moonlight. He watched for a long time, saying nothing, just breathing. His body stopped resisting. His heart began to open. When he left the room, the mirror no longer scared him. It had shown him the truth, not as punishment, but as invitation. Moral of the story: we often look outward for who we are, but our true state is not found in the face we wear. It lives in the feelings we carry. To know yourself is not to judge what you see, but to sit with what you feel. Like a mirror of the heart, awareness reflects emotion, and through gentle attention, peace begins to form. The next story is called Bell Rings in Silence Only. In a small Zen temple hidden among whispering pines, there stood a strange bell. It was cast from an old, dark metal and hung from a simple wooden frame, yet no one had ever heard it ring. There was no striker, no rope, no sound. Visitors often passed by it, puzzled. Some tapped it, some shook their heads and walked on, thinking it was broken or forgotten. But above the bell, carved into a thin wooden plank, were the words, "This bell rings in silence only." A curious student named Lian came to the temple one winter. He asked the head monk, "What does it mean? How can a bell ring in silence?" The monk only smiled and said, "Sit with it, listen." So Lian began to sit near the bell each morning. At first his mind was busy. He imagined thunderous sounds. He strained his ears. Nothing came. Days passed. His frustration grew, but he stayed. Each day, a little longer. Slowly, he stopped waiting for a sound. He began noticing other things: the wind brushing the pine needles, the soft crack of wood expanding in the sun, even the rise and fall of his breath. Then one morning, as a gentle fog rolled in and the world seemed to hush, something happened. Not a sound, not exactly, but a presence. As if the bell itself had filled the space with something deeper than sound, an echo not heard with ears, but felt in the bones. His breath caught, his chest softened, Tears formed. He bowed. The head monk, watching from afar, nodded and whispered, "The bell has rung." Lian understood now. The bell's gift was not in breaking silence, but in deepening it. Its ring came only when the mind stopped reaching and simply opened. Moral of the story: not all things speak through sound. Some truths are too deep for noise. In the quiet beyond thought, we begin to hear with the heart, not the ear. The bell that rings in silence reminds us, the deepest awakenings do not come from what we hear, but from what we feel when everything else falls away. The next story is called Cave Teaches Through Water Drops. Far beyond the last village trail, past tall cliffs and thick trees, there was a hidden cave, known only to a few monks. They called it the Listening Cavernot because of any echo, but because of the sound of water that never stopped. Inside, the air was cool and still, and in the silence, one could hear it clearly, the slow, rhythmic drop of water falling from the ceiling onto a single stone below. Monks who were restless, angry, or lost in thought were often sent there by the abbot not to be punished, but to listen. One such monk, named Sota, had grown frustrated with his own mind. No matter how hard he tried to meditate, his thoughts swirled like leaves in the wind. One evening, the abbot simply handed him a lantern and said, "Go to the cave, sit by the stone, don't ask questions." Sota obeyed. The cave was dark and damp, but not unkind. He sat beside the stone where the water fell on drop, then another. At first, it annoyed him. The sound was too small to focus on, but too steady to ignore. He shifted, sighed, tried to control his breath. Nothing worked. Hours passed. Then, something softened. He began to hear the pause between drops. He noticed how each one landed in the same spot, yet the stone beneath was shaped, worn down not by force, but by time. The water had no power, no rush, no intent to change anything. It simply fell, over and over again, and in doing so, transformed the stone completely. Sota's eyes filled with tears. He realized he had been trying to force peace-grasping, pushing, demanding it to arrive. But the cave taught differently. True change comes gently, slowly, patiently. He sat there until morning, letting the drops fall into him. Moral of the story: lasting peace is not created in a single moment. It comes drop by drop, breath by breath, through quiet persistence. Like water shaping stone, clarity and calm grow not through force but through steady presence. When we stop rushing, the silence begins to teach. The next story is called Name Forgetting. Ritual erases ego. In a remote Zen retreat high in the snowy hills, there was a ritual practiced only once a year, at the turning of winter to spring. It was called the Forgetting, and it was unlike any other tradition in the temple. During this ritual, each monk would give up their name completely. No one could speak it. No one could write it. Their robes bore no symbols, and for 7 days, no one referred to anyone as anyone. When a new monk named Taiko first arrived, he was proud of his background, his knowledge of sutras, his family's lineage, his discipline. But when the time came for the forgetting, the master simply handed him a blank wooden tag and said, "You are no one now. Let the silence show you who remains." At first, Taiko was confused. He wanted to prove himself, to stand out. But without a name, there was nothing to stand behind. He couldn't be praised. He couldn't be corrected by title. No one acknowledged his past or his skills. He was no longer Taiko, just a presence, equal among all. For the first few days, it felt like vanishing. But slowly, something shifted. He noticed the way the others moved with grace, not needing recognition. He noticed how his breath felt in the cold morning air, how the wind didn't care who he was, only that he stood still enough to feel it. By the 5th day, The silence began to feel like freedom. No expectations, no story, just awareness, just life. On the final day, the monks gathered in a circle. The master asked, "Who are you?" Taiko bowed deeply and answered, "No one." "And everyone." The master smiled. "Then the ritual is complete." Moral of the story: the ego is built from names, roles, and stories. But the self behind all that, the quiet, watching self, is where true peace lives. When we let go of identity, even for a moment, we return to something simple and pure. In forgetting who we think we are, we remember what we've always been. The next story is called Winter Monastery Has No Walls. On the snowy plains beyond the mountains, where the wind moved like breath across the earth, there stood a monastery with no walls, no doors, no roof, just a ring of stones marking the space, and a fire that never went out. It was known as the Wind Cloister, and only a few ever sought it. Those who did were often surprised. "How do you meditate here?" they would ask. "There is no shelter, no protection, only cold." But the monks who lived there would bow and reply, "This is the point." One winter, a young monk named Nami was sent to train at the Wind Cloister. She was afraid. She had always associated peace with quiet halls, soft cushions, warm tea. But here, the snow stung her skin, the wind howled through her robes, and the silence was broken by the cracking of ice. Her first days were hard. Her body shivered, her thoughts screamed. She longed for comfort, for walls, for something to close her in and shut the cold out. But the elder monk, June, simply said, "Sit anyway. Let the cold sit with you." So she did. Every morning she sat in the snow with the others. They did not speak. They did not move. They breathed together while the wind passed through them like river water. She wanted to resist. But over time, something changed. She stopped fighting the cold. She stopped needing warmth. Her thoughts, like the snow, began to settle. She felt the wind inside her, like space opening within. And in that openness, there was no more fear, no more longing, only stillness, vast and sharp, like the sky itself. She began to understand. The Wind Cloister was never meant to shelter the body. It was there to expose the mind, to teach that true peace is not built from walls or comfort, but from complete acceptance. Moral of the story: when we stop trying to escape discomfort, we discover a peace that needs no protection. Stillness doesn't grow from what we block out, but from what we allow in. Like a monastery without walls, true serenity is not a space we build, but a space we become. The next story is called Obscure Mudra Unlocks Lucid Dreams. In a quiet temple surrounded by lotus ponds and moonlit reeds, there was a scroll kept sealed in a wooden box, passed down from master to master. It contained a single drawing, a hand gesture delicate, unfamiliar, with fingers bent in ways not taught in the common schools of Zen. It was called Yume no Te, the dreaming hand. Only one monk in each generation was taught its meaning, not for power or escape, but for deep practice. This time, the scroll was passed to a young monk named Naoko, whose dreams were always vivid but scattered symbols, colors, old memories, and rushing rivers with no direction. She studied the mudra for weeks, practicing the shape in meditation, thumb pressing lightly against the third knuckle of her middle finger, palm relaxed, breath slow. Each time she held the position, she repeated a simple phrase in her mind: "This is a dream, and I am awake within it." At first, nothing changed. Her dreams came and went like wind across water. But one night, as rain tapped softly on the roof and the lantern burned low, she fell into sleep while holding the mudra, and the dream was different. She was walking through the temple gardens, but the moonlight was too bright. The lotus flowers whispered. She looked down and realized, I am dreaming. But instead of changing the dream, she listened. The wind told her things she had forgotten. Her teacher's voice came without form. Questions she had buried surfaced, not with fear, but with clarity. She sat in the dream, breathed in the scent of cherry blossoms that bloomed out of season, and wept not from sadness, but recognition. Night after night, she returned. And in each dream, she learned something deeper about attachment, about forgiveness, about the parts of herself she had never dared to face when awake. One morning, her master bowed to her and said, "Now you understand. The mind cannot always be reached by day." Moral of the story: not all awareness comes while awake. The dream world holds keys to our inner rooms, places too deep, too guarded, for daylight to enter. When we meet our dreams with presence, they become more than illusions. They become mirrors, showing us where we're holding on and where we're ready to let go. The next story is called Pebble Ritual Soaks Up Fear. In a quiet valley surrounded by whispering reeds, there was a stream so clear it mirrored the sky. Along its bank, a Zen teacher named Aya led a ritual passed down in silence. It was simple, soft, and almost unknown to the outside world. She called it the letting stone. Each morning at dawn, Aya and her students walked barefoot to the stream. No words were spoken. Each person chose one small pebble from the path, nothing special, just one that fit in the palm, smooth and cool from the night. Aya taught her students to hold the pebble tightly in both hands. "Pour into it," she once whispered to a boy who trembled. "Pour in the thing you don't want to carry anymore." The students stood with eyes closed. They didn't name their fear aloud. Some were afraid of failure, others of loss, rejection, loneliness, or death. Some didn't even know what they feared, only that their hearts were heavy. They stood silently, breathing, feeling the weight of the stone grow not from the earth, but from within. Then, gently, they stepped into the stream. Knees shaking, eyes stinging from cold, they released the pebble into the water, not tossed, not thrown, just released. The stream took it, quietly, and the ritual was done. One day, a new student asked Aya, "Do the pebbles really take away the fear?" Aya smiled and said, "No, but the hands that let go become lighter." The student stood in the water for a long time that morning, holding her fear like a secret, until she could feel it soften. When she finally let go, it wasn't just the pebble that fell, it was the belief that fear owned her. Moral of the story: fear cannot always be solved or silenced, but it can be released. When we face it gently, name it silently, and let it pass through our hands, it begins to lose shape. Like a pebble carried away by water, fear softens when we stop gripping it. Stillness begins the moment we let go. The next story is called Monk Meditates with a Wasp Hive. In the warm valley of a forest temple, where bamboo swayed and rivers whispered through mossy stones, there was a monk named Katsu who was known for his restless spirit. No matter how long he sat in meditation, his mind buzzed with thoughts: regret, desire, worry, impatience. He asked the master again and again, "How do I quiet my mind?" The master did not answer. One morning, he simply handed Katsu a candle and pointed toward the back edge of the temple grounds. There, hidden in a hollow tree trunk, was a wasp, hive alive with movement, low humming, and danger. The master said only, "Sit beside it. Do not disturb it. Learn." Katsu hesitated, but obeyed. The first time he sat near the hive, fear surged in his chest. He flinched at every buzz, every flicker of wings. He imagined stings, swelling, pain. His breath quickened. His heart pounded louder than the hive itself. But the wasps didn't move toward him. They simply flew in and out, doing what they always did without malice, without notice. Day after day, Katsu returned. He sat closer. He breathed slower. Slowly, something strange began to happen. His fear dulled. His thoughts, once loud and racing, began to mirror the rhythm of the hive, steady, focused, alive but not frantic. The hum no longer felt threatening. It became a song. He realized the wasps were not dangerous unless disturbed, just like his thoughts. He saw that his own mind was not the enemy. It only stung when poked, prodded, resisted. When he left it alone, it moved naturally, beautifully. By the end of the season, Katsu could sit inches from the hive, completely still, even with wasps circling his head, not because he had overcome fear, but because he had stopped fighting it. The master watched him return one evening, calmer than ever, and smiled. "You've learned not to silence the noise," he said, "but to be unmoved by it." Moral of the story: the mind, like a wasp hive, becomes dangerous when disturbed, but when observed without fear, its buzzing softens into rhythm. Peace is not the absence of thought, but the space within it. True stillness is not found in escape, but in fearless presence. The next story is called Sand Patterns. Erase themselves instantly. In the center of a small, wind-blown temple near the sea, there was no statue, no altar, only a wide circle of sand. It was smooth, untouched, and pale like moonlight. Each morning at sunrise, a monk named Haru would enter the circle barefoot, carrying a long wooden rake. He never spoke. With gentle, flowing motions, he drew intricate patterns in the sand spirals, waves, and lines that seemed to breathe as they formed. Visitors came from far away just to watch. The quiet beauty of the moment was spellbinding, like watching stillness take shape. But before anyone could take a picture or even blink twice, Haru would lift the rake and gently erase his own work, smoothing every line until the sand was empty again. Then he bowed and walked away. Some visitors were confused, others were frustrated. One morning, a guest asked aloud, "Why make something so beautiful only to destroy it?" Haru paused and smiled. He placed the rake in the man's hands and said, "Try." The guest raked the sand carefully, creating a design he was proud of. But when Haru motioned for him to erase it, the guest hesitated. His hands froze. "It feels like loss," the guest whispered. Haru nodded, then quietly said, "Now you understand." The next morning, the guest returned early. He raked a pattern in silence. When it was done, he erased it himself slowly, gently. He did not feel loss this time. He felt peace. He understood that beauty does not depend on how long something lasts. It lives in how fully we are present for it. Day after day, he kept returning, not to watch, but to practice, to create, to release. Moral of the story: not all things are meant to last. Some truths appear and vanish in the same breath. When we stop clinging to what we create, our thoughts, our plans, even our identities, we begin to taste freedom. Like sand, smoothed by wind, peace lives not in what remains, but in how we let go. The next story is called Scroll on Zen Absurdity, Forbidden. In the deepest room of an old temple hidden among misty cliffs, there was a locked wooden box, wrapped in black silk and sealed with red wax. No monk was allowed to open it. Not even the senior disciples dared touch it. It was known only as the Laughing Scroll, and its legend passed quietly through whispers, that it held the words of a master who had gone Mador, enlightened beyond reason. The scroll was said to contain teachings so strange, so contradictory, that the elders declared it dangerous. Zen is discipline, they said. Zen is silence. But some knew that the master who wrote it, Master Enso, was once revered for his deep stillness, his piercing wisdom, and his sudden, unexplained laughter that echoed across the valley before he vanished. Years later, a young monk named Yuto found himself tormented by doubt. The more he meditated, the more questions arose. What is the right way? Am I doing this correctly? What if the path is an illusion? His mind became a knot of rules and fears. One night, unable to sleep, Yuto wandered the halls and came to the sealed box. Something in him, reckless, desperate, moved his hands before thought could stop him. He broke the seal, unfolded the scroll. The first line read, "To chase enlightenment is like trying to sneeze with your eyes open, impressive, pointless, and slightly painful." He blinked. The next lines were stranger still. "If a monk finds peace, take his cushion away. If a bell rings, answer it with a dance. If the sky turns green, laugh then meditate." Yuto laughed. First a small chuckle, then a loud, aching laugh that rolled from his belly. Not because he understood, but because for the first time, he didn't need to. Something cracked open. Not logic, not knowledge, just freedom. The next morning, the master found the scroll unsealed. But seeing Yuto's face soft, clear, unburdened, he said nothing, only bowed. Moral of the story: wisdom isn't always solemn. The mind can become a trap when it takes the path too seriously. Sometimes, awakening arrives not in silence, but in laughter, when we realize that clinging to meaning is just another form of noise. Zen doesn't always make sense. That's why it works. The next story is called Koan Only Speech Day. Once a year, deep within a forest monastery wrapped in mist and pine, the monks practiced something rare: Koan Day. From sunrise to sunset, no ordinary words were allowed. No greetings, no instructions, no conversation. On this day, every sentence spoken had to be a koana, paradoxical riddle meant not to be answered, but to awaken. Where is the sound of one hand clapping? If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. What was your face before your parents were born? These were the only words spoken. For visitors and new monks, the day was confusing, even frustrating. They asked questions and received riddles. They sought help and met only silence or worse, questions that made no sense. One young novice named Taro struggled deeply with the practice. He had just arrived at the monastery, full of eager questions. How do I meditate correctly? What is the path? Am I making progress? But every monk answered with a koan. Does a dog have Buddha, nature? What is the sound of the bell that doesn't ring? By noon, Taro felt lost, angry. He sat alone in the garden, clutching a stone, his thoughts loud and spinning. Then the old abbot appeared beside him and said softly, "A goose is trapped in a bottle. How do you free it without breaking the glass?" Taro stared at him, speechless. "I don't know," he muttered. The abbot smiled. "And yet you are already outside the bottle." At first, Taro didn't understand, but something in the abbot's eyes made him stop thinking. For the first time, he sat not to figure things out, but to simply sit. And there, in the sound of the wind through the leaves, something shifted. No answers came, but neither did the need for them. He smiled. Moral of the story: wisdom cannot always be reached by logic. Some truths cannot be spoken plainly. They must be lived, felt, awakened. A koan is not a puzzle to be solved, but a mirror to the mind. When we stop needing to understand, we begin to see. The real answer is not in words, but in presence. The next story is called Soaking Rainwalk Practice to Surrender. In a mountain temple where clouds rolled low and the sky often wept, there was an unusual practice taught only to those who struggled with control, those who clenched their thoughts too tightly, who resisted every discomfort, who feared being seen undone. The monks called it simply the rainwalk. It was not written in any manual. It was not a ritual spoken aloud. It was given in silence when the sky turned grey and the master knew someone was ready. A monk named Shoma had reached that point. Though disciplined and intelligent, he was stiff in his meditation, guarded in his emotions, and afraid to let anything touch him too deeply. One day, after confessing his exhaustion to the master, the old monk simply said, "When the rain begins, walk." Soon, thunder rolled through the hills. The sky broke open. Shoma stood at the edge of the courtyard, robes dry, heart tight. His instinct said to cover himself, to wait for the storm to pass. But the master stood nearby, watching with steady eyes. So he stepped into the rain. The first drops hit like cold coins. His shoulders tensed. He tried to maintain composure, but the rain did not carete, soaked him slowly. Then all at once, his robe clung to his skin. His breath quickened. The earth softened beneath his feet. At first he felt exposed, embarrassed. Then something shifted. With each step, something heavy inside him began to melt. The worry, the effort, the image of being a good monk. His thoughts dripped off him like water. He stopped walking in defiance and began walking in surrender. He laughed, not loudly, but quietly, like a man waking from a long, dry sleep. He lifted his face to the rain. It kissed his forehead, touched his closed eyes. And he kept walking, softer now, barefoot and free. When he returned to the temple, soaked and silent, the master nodded once. Moral of the story: surrender does not mean weakness. It means trusting the moment enough to let go. When we stop resisting life's storms and let ourselves be soaked, we discover a deeper stillness beneath control. Sometimes, peace is not in staying dry, but in walking fully into the rain and letting it wash us clean. The next story is called Monthly Vow to Discard Teachings. At a quiet monastery nestled between stone hills and slow rivers, there was a tradition that confused many and comforted few. On the first morning of every month, the monks gathered in the main hall not to study, not to chant, but to let go. It was called the emptying. Each monk brought with them the scrolls they had studied, the notes they had written, the words from their teachers that had inspired them. These teachings were not thrown away or burned, but placed gently into a wooden box. The box was sealed, carried down the mountain, and stored in silence, never to be opened again. New monks protested. "These are sacred words," they said. "Why discard what we've worked so hard to learn?" The abbot, an old woman with a soft gaze and a quiet voice, replied, "Because clinging to truth is just another form of clinging." One student, Jun, struggled the most. He had filled his journals with insights and quotes, drawings of sutras, and carefully copied koans. When his turn came to place them in the box, his hands trembled. "This is everything I know," he whispered. The abbot nodded. "And now you will know something else." Reluctantly, Jun surrendered the pages. For days, he felt empty and anchored, almost foolish. But as the month passed, he noticed something shifting. Without his notes to guide him, he began to rely on presence. He listened more. He observed the wind. He sat with the moon instead of his scrolls. And in that stillness, understanding returned not as words, but as knowing. When the next month came, he placed a single blank page into the box, and he smiled. Moral of the story: wisdom is not something to collect, it is something to live. Even the truest words become noise if we cling too tightly. When we empty our hands of what we once needed, we make space for what is here now. Letting go of teachings is not forgetting, it is stepping beyond, where silence becomes the teacher and life becomes the text. The next story is called One Breath Bow. Clear's ancestral weight. In a windswept temple built on a ridge of sacred stones, the monks practiced a simple ritual at sunrise each morning: one deep breath, one silent bow. No chants, no offerings, just that. To outsiders, it seemed almost too simple, but the monks knew this ritual was not for the body, but for the unseen burdens each of them carried. A young monk named Ray arrived, carrying more than his robe revealed. His family had known sorrow for generations, violence, abandonment, stories too painful to speak. Though he had walked far to reach the temple, the weight of what came before him clung to his shoulders. Even in stillness, his chest stayed tight. Even in silence, his heart felt noisy. One morning, after struggling to concentrate during zazen, the elder monk placed a hand on Ray's back and whispered, "Bow. One breath. Give it back." Ray stepped onto the temple's front stones, just as the first light touched the sky. The wind was soft. The moment felt ordinary. He inhaled as deeply as he could, pulling in every name, every silence, every face he'd never met but somehow still carried. With his exhale, he bowed. In that one movement, something shifted. A tightness in his ribs released. A grief he hadn't named fell gently behind him. Not erased, not forgotten, but honored and let go. He began to bow every morning, not to a god, not to a statue, but to the thread that had brought him here. He bowed for the mother who cried alone, for the grandfather who had no words, for the child within him that still longed for peace. Over time, his breath grew lighter, his steps softer. He no longer bowed from duty, but from love. Moral of the story: the past lives in the body as much as the mind. We carry what was never ours until we choose to bow, not in apology, but in release. One breath, one honest bow, and the weight of generations can begin to soften. Healing sometimes starts not with answers, but with silent respect for all that came before. The next story is called 10-Line Sutra, Only Read Once. In a hidden temple carved into the side of a quiet mountain, there existed a single scroll. It was kept in a small wooden box, sealed with a silk ribbon, the color of early morning fog. The scroll held a sacred sutra just 10 lines long. The rule was simple, yet absolute. It could only be read once. One moment, one reading. Then it was returned to its box, never to be seen again. The sutra was not copied, not shared, not repeated aloud. It was trusted to memory and the heart alone. Some monks waited years before asking permission to read it. Others never dared. But all knew the moment of reading must be chosen with deep intention. A monk named Riku waited 10 years. Each season, he asked himself, "Am I ready to receive what cannot be returned?" Each year, he found more reasons to wait. He feared he wouldn't understand, or worse, that he would understand and lose it. But one evening, after sitting in silence beneath a sky scattered with stars, he awoke before dawn and walked barefoot to the inner hall. The abbot was already there, waiting. "Now?" she asked. He nodded. His hands were steady. She opened the box. Riku bowed and read. 10 lines. No more. The words were simple, soft, about breath, impermanence, the truth of now, but they struck deeper than any teaching he had known. He felt them land not on the mind, but in the soul, not as knowledge, but as remembrance. His chest ached, his eyes burned. It felt like watching a loved one disappear just as you finally understood them. He returned the scroll. It was never opened again in his lifetime. Years later, when a student asked him what the sutra had said, he smiled gently and replied, "Nothing I can repeat, and everything I still live." Moral of the story: some truths are not meant to be memorized, they are meant to transform. The deepest wisdom does not need to be read again, because it does not live in words, but in the way we breathe, walk, and choose each moment. When we truly receive the present, once is enough. The next story is called Wooden Frog Passed to Signal Awakening. At the heart of a small, hidden temple surrounded by rice fields and fog, there was a carved wooden frog, smooth, worn by time, and no larger than a closed fist. It sat on the altar, silent and unremarkable, but every monk knew it held meaning deeper than words. No one claimed to own it. No one dared move it casually. It was only passed from one monk to another when something inside them had shifted, not because they said the right words or mastered a practice, but because something quiet had opened. It had been over 9 years since the frog had last moved. A young monk named Sora came to the temple, driven not by ambition but by something he couldn't name, ache, a longing to feel whole. He was kind and diligent, but he often asked the same question: how will I know when I've awakened? Each time, the head monk would say, when you stop asking, you'll begin to see. Sora studied, meditated, and swept the temple floors, but still the frog remained where it was. One spring morning, after failing once again to quiet his thoughts, Sora gave up. Not in defeat, but in surrender. He walked into the garden and sat beneath the blooming plum tree. He watched the petals fall. One landed on his palm, then was taken by the breeze. He didn't move. He didn't think. He just was. And in that moment, he felt it. No fireworks, no visions, just stillness, and the soft smile of someone who had finally stopped searching. Later that evening, without a word, the head monk walked into the hall, picked up the wooden frog, and placed it beside Sora's cushion. Sora bowed, tears filling his eyes, not because he had arrived, but because he had let go. Moral of the story: awakening is not a prize to be claimed, but a silence that arrives when we stop reaching. The wooden frog is not a reward, it's a mirror, passed only when someone no longer needs to be seen. The deepest moments in Zen are never loud. They are quiet enough to be missed, unless you're truly present. The next story is called Dusk-Only Meditation for Shadow Thoughts. At a small temple built where the forest met the sky, there was a practice kept secret from sunrise. It was not done in the bright light of day or the quiet stillness of midnight. It happened only at dusk, when the light thinned, when shadows grew long, and when the world turned a shade softer and sadder. It was called shadow sitting. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the monks would gather in the garden without candles, without words. They sat facing the direction of the fading light, eyes half closed, letting the deepening dark meet their minds. But this was not a meditation for peace or clarity. This was a meditation for the thoughts they kept hidden, the ones not fit for daylight. One young monk, Akio, struggled with anger he couldn't name and fears he couldn't quiet. He tried to push them down during morning chants, tried to silence them during breathwork, but they always returned when he was alone. One evening, the teacher said, "Come sit with your shadows." Akio sat in the garden with the others. The air was cool, the light faded. At first, he felt the usual restlessness. Then the thoughts began to rise, old regrets, silent shame, things he wished weren't true. His instinct was to push them away, but no one else moved. The dusk held them all. So Akio did something he never had before. He let the thoughts come. He didn't fight. He didn't fix. He just sat. The fear, the anger, the guilt, each one passed through like clouds over a still pond. They were loud, then quiet, then gone. For the first time, he saw them not as enemies, but as visitors. When night finally fell and the teacher stood, Akio felt something he hadn't in years. Not comfort, but honesty. And in that honesty, a strange peace. Moral of the story: not all meditation is for calming the mind. Some is for meeting what hides beneath it. When we sit at dusk, we sit with what the day avoids. Shadow thoughts lose power, not when we run from them, But when we face them with stillness, in darkness faced gently, we find light. The next story is called Echo Bird Calls to Silence the Mind. In a quiet forest temple nestled among tall cedar trees, the monks followed a daily rhythm of chanting, cleaning, and deep meditation. But there was one practice rarely spoken of, something offered only to those whose minds remained busy, no matter how long they sat. It was called Koe no Utsushi, echoing the bird. When a student's mind was too full, the master would lead them into the forest at dawn, just before the sun crested the hills. No robes, no cushion, no mantra, only their breath and the sounds of the waking forest. A novice named Mika was one such student. Her thoughts came fast, and often memories, doubts, sharp self-judgment. She couldn't quiet the noise. One morning, the master called her aside and simply said, "Follow the birds, echo them." Mika was confused. She expected instruction. Instead, the master disappeared into the woods, leaving her standing alone as morning birds began to sing. At first, she only listened, awkward, uncertain. Then, timidly, she tried repeating the sounds. A sharp chirp, a soft coo, a long trill. It felt strange at first, even foolish, but she kept going. One call at a time, matching tone, matching rhythm. Her voice began to loosen. Her breath found a new rhythm. Her thoughts quieted. The birds did not pause for her. They did not mind her presence. And as she mimicked their calls, her inner voice began to vanish. There was no room for it, only listening, repeating, becoming part of the forest's morning song. An hour passed, then two. She hadn't noticed the time. When she returned to the temple, her face was soft, her shoulders lighter. She bowed before the master, who only said, "When you leave the mind, you enter the world." Moral of the story: the mind often grows loud when we forget to listen, but nature asks nothing of usually our attention. When we echo the world instead of trying to outthink it, the self dissolves into sound, and the chatter fades. Peace does not always come in silence. Sometimes it arrives in song. The next story is called Candle Blown, Out to Embrace Endings. In a quiet monastery nestled near the edge of a lake, there was a ritual held once every full moon. It was called the Final Flame. No chants, no bells, no teachings, only a single candle, lit at dusk and left to burn through the night in the center of the meditation hall. Every monk would take turns sitting beside it in silence. No one touched it, no one spoke. The flame flickered gently, casting shadows on the walls like memories passing through time. At dawn, the youngest monk present was asked to blow out the candle. One morning, it was Airi's turn. She was just 15, newly accepted into the monastery, still holding tightly to the grief of losing her mother the winter before. When the abbot nodded for her to step forward, Airi hesitated. Her hands trembled. She looked at the flamme not just as wax and fire, but as something more. It reminded her of her mother's warmth, her laughter, the stories they used to share by lantern light. To blow it out felt like saying goodbye all over again. The abbot, watching gently, said, "You are not ending the flame, you are honoring it." Airi closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then one soft breath and the candle went out. The room fell into silence, complete, whole. And in that stillness, Airi felt something she hadn't expected: relief. Not because the light was gone, but because she had let it go with love, not fear. Later, she asked the abbot why the ritual was done each month. He answered, "Because we forget that endings are sacred. We try to hold on too long, afraid of darkness. But when we learn to blow out the candle with grace, we begin to understand nothing is truly lost, only changed." Moral of the story: endings are not failures, they are moments of return. When we let go without resistance, we make space for what is next. Like the breath that extinguishes a flame, peace comes not from holding on, but from releasing gently. In every ending, there is the beginning of stillness. The next story is called Temple Built on Single Grain of Rice. Far beyond the noise of cities, where mountains rolled like sleeping giants and clouds moved like breath, there stood a temple said to be unlike any other. From a distance, it looked ordinary wooden beams, stone lanterns, a bell that swayed in the wind. But those who visited noticed something strange. The silence there felt heavier, fuller, as if the earth beneath it had a heartbeat. The temple's name was Hitomeji, the One Grain. And hidden in its founding story was a mystery whispered only among senior monks, that the entire temple was built upon a single grain of rice. Many thought it was metaphor, a riddle perhaps, but the master said otherwise. A young monk named Anju once asked the abbot, "How can something so vast rest on something so small?" The abbot led him to the meditation hall, sat him down, and placed a single grain of rice in his palm. "Hold this," he said. "Now sit, as long as you can." Anju sat. At first his focus was on the rice, its texture, its lightness, its fragility. But soon thoughts drifted in, restlessness followed. His hand began to tremble. He worried it would fall, and still he sat. Hours passed. The grain never moved, but his mind did. By dusk, tears fell from his eyes, not from pain, but from realization. The temple was not built on the rice itself, but on what it represented, the power of a single, focused moment, a single breath, a single act of stillness. When he returned the grain to the master, he bowed so deeply his forehead touched the floor. The master whispered, "When one moment is fully honored, it can hold the entire world." Moral of the story: great peace doesn't come from grand things. It begins with something small, something whole, something given full attention. One breath, one step, one grain of rice. The mind, like a temple, becomes steady not by piling more but by resting completely on the moment we are in. The next story is called Monk Walks Backward 10 Years. In a remote village surrounded by rice fields and old stone paths, there lived a monk named Kain who, one day, made a quiet vow. He would walk only backward for 10 full years. No one asked him to do it. There was no command from a teacher, no ancient scroll to follow. When asked why, Kain simply said, "I've spent too much of my life rushing forward without understanding where I've been." From that day on, he walked in reverse, through markets, forests, temples, and river-sown, slow, steady step at a time. He used a mirror tied around his chest to guide his path, but often relied more on listening, on feeling the shape of the ground beneath his feet, and on trusting where he had come from. At first, people laughed. Children followed him in curiosity. Some called him mad, others called him wise. But Kain never answered. He just walked softly, silently, backward. As the years passed, something strange happened. His steps became more careful, his breath slower, his awareness deepened. Without rushing ahead, he noticed things others missed: a petal falling, an elder's quiet sigh, the sound of a butterfly's wings. He saw the pain in people's faces before they smiled, heard the question behind the question. He had become more present by walking into the past. When the 10th year came, Kain stopped. He stood at the edge of a mountain cliff where he had first made his vow. Then, without a word, he turned to face forward. A student waiting for him there asked, "What did you learn from 10 years walking away?" Kain looked into the horizon and said, "I now know where I am." Moral of the story: we often rush forward trying to find peace, but sometimes clarity comes from turning around. When we slow down, revisit our steps, and stop running from our past, we begin to understand the present. Like a monk walking backward, wisdom doesn't always move in straight lines. It often asks us to return before we can truly arrive. The next story is called Writing About the Temple Makes It Vanish. There was a legend spoken quietly among travelers and monks. Deep in the forest, beyond marked roads and known trails, there existed a temple so serene, so full of stillness, that those who found it felt their suffering dissolve without a word. No signs pointed to it, no maps showed the way. It was simply called the Vanishing Temple. Many sought it. A few claimed to have seen it. Fewer returned with anything to say. One such seeker was a devoted scribe named Haru. He had spent his life chronicling temples, sutras, teachings, believing that, by writing the truth, he could preserve it for others. When he heard whispers of the vanishing temple, he made it his mission to find it and document every detail. He walked for days in silence, following intuition more than direction. On the fourth morning, he entered a clearing washed in golden light. There it was. The temple was simply no ornaments, no gates, just wood and air and silence so deep it felt alive. Haru stepped forward, bowed, and sat beneath a tree. His thoughts quieted. His body felt weightless. He did not need to speak. For the first time in his life, he had no urge to write, just to be. But eventually, the mind crept back. I must remember this. I must write this down. As he reached for his journal, the light dimmed. The trees shifted. The temple faded, first the roof, then the walls, then the ground beneath it. In moments it was gone. Only forest remained. He blinked in disbelief. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. He returned to the village below and told the elder what had happened. The elder nodded. That temple was never meant to be captured. It lives only in presence. Try to possess it, and it disappears. Try to describe it, and it becomes a story, not a truth. Haru never tried to write it again, but in the silence between his thoughts, he could still feel it. Moral of the story: some truths can't be held, only lived. The deepest peace slips away when we try to name or own it. Presence is like a sacred template, vanishes the moment we try to make it ours, and returns only when we surrender completely to now. The next story is called Dreamed Monk Etched into Stone. In the hills above a river village, carved into the cliffside, was the image of a monk etched in stone so delicately that his eyes seemed to blink when the light shifted. His face was serene, his robes flowing like wind. No one knew who had carved him, no records, no name. The villagers called him the Dreamed Monk. The name came from an old story passed down in whispers. Generations ago, a young sculptor named Ren had arrived in the village, quiet and burdened by sorrow. He had wandered for years, lost after his master died without finishing a final teaching. Night after night, Ren dreamed of a monk sitting in silence, smiling, not speaking, not moving, only being. The dream never changed. One dawn, Ren woke with tears on his cheeks and climbed to the cliffs. He began carving with bare hands and crude tools, without sketch, without plan. Every line came from memory, not of the world, but of the dream. Day after day, he worked. And as the stone took shape, the monk from his dreams emerged, slowly, from the mountain itself. When the sculpture was complete, Ren sat before it and closed his eyes. He never came down again. Some say he disappeared into the dream. Now, travelers visit the etched monk, expecting answers or blessings. Most see only stone, but a few those who arrive without seeking say the statue feels alive, that in the stillness of its face, something soft stirs in the heart. Not a voice, not a message, just knowing. A student once asked the village elder, "Why do people dream of this monk when they've never seen him?" The elder smiled and said, "Because he isn't made of stone. He's made of silence, and silence lives in everyone. Moral of the story: some truths are not taught, they are remembered, often in stillness, often in dreams. The clearest teachers are not always real in form, but real in feeling. When we stop searching with the eyes and begin to listen with the soul, even stone can whisper. The deepest wisdom is etched not in words, but in presence. The next story is called Koi Swims Only During Meditation. At a tranquil temple nestled beside a still pond, there lived a single koi fish, pale gold, nearly invisible beneath the water's surface. Visitors often passed by the pond without noticing it. The water was so calm, so undisturbed, it looked empty, but the monks knew the truth. They called the fish Shizuka, which means silence, and they said it would only swim when someone nearby entered deep meditation. Many doubted the tale. Some sat by the pond and pretended to be still, peeking through half-open eyes, waiting to catch a glimpse. But the koi never moved. Others grew impatient and walked away, declaring the story a myth. Then one day, a tired traveler named Mai arrived at the temple. She had searched many places for peace, tried many techniques, read many books, but her heart remained heavy. The abbot said gently, "Do not search harder, just sit by the pond and breathe." So Mai sat, not to summon the koi, not to succeed, just to rest. Her breath slowed, her thoughts came and went like passing clouds. She let them pass. She didn't reach for peace. She just stayed. And then, without movement, without sound, the koi began to swim. It glided in slow, graceful circles, its golden body shimmering just beneath the surface. Mai did not open her eyes. She didn't need to. She felt the presence, the quiet beauty of it. It wasn't proof. It was something deeper, like being trusted by the moment itself. When she finally stood, the koi was still again, resting at the pond's edge. A younger monk, watching nearby, asked her, "What did you do to make it appear?" She smiled. "I stopped trying to make anything happen." Moral of the story: peace cannot be chased. Like the koi beneath still waters, it emerges only when we stop stirring the mind. The deeper the stillness, the clearer the presence. In true meditation, we do not awaken peace, it awakens us. And like the koi, it comes only when invited by quiet and never by force. The next story is called Haiku Whispered Once a Century. Deep within a cedar forest where light barely touched the mossy ground, there stood a tiny wooden shrine, weathered by time, untouched by travelers. It held no statue, no offerings, only a narrow slit in the wood where wind passed through. And when the wind was just right, once in a lifetime, or maybe once in a century, it whispered a haiku. The shrine was known by only a few monks from the Eastern Temple, and even they had only heard of it. No one knew if the haiku was real or imagined. Still, every 100 years, when the moon marked a certain day on the ancient calendar, one monk would be chosen to sit beside the shrine and wait in silence. The chosen monk would sit alone, from sunrise to nightfall, listening to nothing but the wind. When the time came, a young monk named Soma was chosen. He was humble, thoughtful, and carried the quiet ache of wanting to know truth more deeply. He arrived at the shrine in the early morning, sat cross-legged on the cold earth, and waited. Hours passed. The wind blew and faded. His legs ached. His mind wandered. But still, he stayed. Then, just as the sun slipped behind the trees and the forest held its breath, the wind returned soft and slow. It passed through the slit in the wood and formed words, not loud, but clear, as if spoken just beneath hearing. Soma closed his eyes and listened. The haiku was brief. 7 heartbeats, maybe less. The words were simple, but they touched something deeper than thought, like hands pressing gently on his chest from inside. Tears slid down his cheeks. He didn't try to remember the lines. He knew he wouldn't forget. He returned to the temple the next day in silence. When the elder asked what the haiku had said, Soma only bowed and whispered, "It said exactly what I needed, and nothing more." Moral of the story: some wisdom comes once in a lifetime, to be captured, but to be felt. Truth does not shout. It arrives like wind through wood when the world is still enough to receive it. The deepest teachings are brief, quiet, and perfectly timed. The next story is called Reverse Bell Creates Silence, Not Sound. In the center of a wind-swept monastery on a mountain ridge stood a strange object, a bell made of polished stone, shaped not to ring, but to absorb sound. It was unlike any bell ever made. There was no striker, no chime. Instead, when someone approached and spoke near it, the bell seemed to swallow the words, leaving behind only stillness. It was called the Reverse Bell. New monks were told to visit it when their minds were too loud. Many were skeptical. "A bell is meant to be heard," they'd say, but the master would only reply, "This one is meant to be felt." A young monk named Toshi struggled with a restless mind. His thoughts ran like wild horses, always chasing the next idea, the next answer, the next fear. One evening, after failing again to sit in peace, he was sent to the reverse bell. He knelt beside it and whispered, "I don't know how to be still." The bell gave no reply, but something lifted in the silence that followed like dust settling in the air. He returned the next night, and the next, each time offering a new thought, a confession, a doubt. "I am afraid. I want to be better. I don't know who I am." And every time, the bell took his words and gave back only silence. But not empty silence, full silence, soft, spacious, like being wrapped in sky. After many nights, Toshi no longer spoke. He just sat beside the bell, and in the presence of that deep quiet, his mind began to slow. The wild thoughts still came, but they no longer dragged him. They passed like clouds, and he stayed grounded like stone. One day, he turned to his teacher and said, "I thought I needed answers, but I needed stillness." The teacher smiled, and the bell gave it. Moral of the story: not all bells are meant to ring, some are meant to quiet. In a noisy world, silence is not nothing. It is a gift, a mirror, a medicine. When we pour our thoughts into stillness, we do not lose them, we release them, and in return, we find ourselves. The next story is called Bird Nests in Emptied Minds. In a quiet monastery perched above flowering fields, there was a saying carved into the gate: "Only the empty mind can be home to the bird." New students often puzzled over the words. Some believed it was metaphor, others thought it was poetry, but the monks spoke of it as truth, not a lesson, but a happening. One spring, a novice named Ren arrived. His thoughts crowded with ambition. He wished to be wise, to be calm, to achieve the silence he had read about in books. Every time he sat in meditation, he clung to his breath like it was a task to complete. He analyzed each passing thought, judged his progress, chased perfection. Still, his mind stayed loud. One afternoon, the abbot placed a cushion outside beneath a fig tree and motioned for Ren to sit. "Stay," he said, "but not to succeed. Stay until your mind is like an open window." Ren sat. The sun warmed his back. Bees hummed nearby. But still, thoughts circled. After hours, frustration gave way to tiredness, then tiredness to surrender. He let go, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't hold on anymore. And in that surrender, silence opened. Not forced, not empty, just spacious. A soft flutter brushed the air. Ren opened his eyes slightly and saw a small bird landing on his shoulder. It stood there, calm, light as breath, and then flew to the crook of the tree above. There, It began to gather twigs. The abbot, watching from a distance, smiled. It always knows. Ren said nothing. There was nothing to say. The bird returned the next day, and the next, building its nest slowly above the cushion where Ren now sat each morning, not to achieve stillness but to be still. Moral of the story: peace does not nest in minds crowded with striving. Like a bird searching for a quiet branch, it lands only where there is space. When we release the grip of thought, effort, and identity, life itself finds us. The emptied mind is not blank, it is open. And in that openness, gentle truths come home. The next story is called Monk Berry's Name, Under Cherry Tree. In a temple where cherry blossoms bloomed like soft pink clouds each spring, a young monk named Tetsu carried a quiet burden, his name. Not just the word, but all that came with it: his past, his family's expectations, the reputation he had built before becoming a monk. He was praised for his discipline, admired for his memory, and often told he would be a great teacher one day. But the praise began to weigh on him. In every bow he felt the need to be worthy. In every silence he could still hear his name echoing in his mind, like a title he hadn't asked for. Even in meditation, the image of himself would rise, dressed in robes, admired, known. One day, the abbot noticed the tension in his eyes and handed him a small scroll. On it was written, "To become no one is to become free." He offered no explanation, only pointed to the ancient cherry tree in the garden and said, "When you're ready." That night, while the moon cast pale light over the falling blossoms, Tetsu took a piece of paper and wrote his name slowly, carefully, as if letting go of a part of his own skin. He folded it, placed it in a small wooden box, and walked to the tree. There, he dug a shallow hole beneath the roots and buried his name beneath the petals. He didn't pray, he didn't cry. He just stood in the silence, feeling the wind brush against his face, as if the tree itself was bowing back. From that day forward, he never corrected anyone who forgot his name. He answered only to presence. In time, the other monks stopped using names with him. He became known simply as the one who bows with the blossoms. And in that namelessness, Tetsu, without title, past, or label, became more fully himself than ever before. Moral of the story: we cling to names as if they are who we are, but they are only shadows of the self. When we release identity, what we've been called, what we think we must be, return to the simple, quiet truth of being. Peace begins when there is nothing left to prove. The next story is called Fog Teaches by Obscuring Path. In a quiet coastal village where cliffs met the sea, there was a forest trail said to lead to a hidden Zen hermitage. But the trail was only walkable on certain mornings, those filled with thick, white fog. On clear days, the path vanished, as if it had never existed. Many monks came eager to find the hermitage. They waited for the fog to lift, believing clarity would show the way. But they always returned, confused, unable to find it. The locals would only shrug and say, "The path does not appear when you want to see it, appears when you accept not seeing." One monk, a woman named Naoko, came after years of inner struggle. She had read every sutra, chanted every verse, but still felt distant from peace. When she arrived, the fog had already rolled in thick, wet, and silent. She stood at the forest's edge and could see no more than 2 steps ahead. But instead of waiting for it to pass, she bowed and entered. With each step, the world disappeared behind her. The trees became shadows. The sound of the sea dulled. The trail bent in directions she could not predict. She stumbled more than once. Her heart beat fast, but slowly the fear began to soften. She realized something strange. The fog made her present. There was no space for thinking ahead, no use for memory. Only this step, then the next. Trust, breath, surrender. After an hour of walking through whiteness, the fog began to lift. Not all at once, just enough for her to see a small gate carved of wood, moss-covered, open. The hermitage stood beyond, quiet and waiting. An old monk greeted her with a bow and said, "You found the way not by seeing, but by walking." Naoko smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. She had found more than a path, she had found trust. Moral of the story: sometimes life hides the way forward, so we stop looking ahead and start arriving in each step. The fog is not confusion, it is invitation. When we stop fearing the unknown and begin walking with presence, the path reveals itself. Not all clarity comes from lightsome, is born in mist. The next story is called Midnight Mountain Climb Gives Insight. There was a tradition held in secret among the elder monks of a hidden Zen monastery, a journey taken only once in a lifetime and always alone. It was never announced or scheduled. When the time was right, the abbot would place a small lantern beside a monk's cushion. That was the only sign. One cold autumn evening, a monk named Daichi returned to his quarters after evening meditation and found the lantern waiting. No words, no instruction, only the light. He understood. At midnight, with only the lantern and his breath, Daichi began the long climb up Mount Kiho, a sacred peak behind the temple where wind never ceased and no paths were marked. The mountain was steep and the darkness was thick. Every step was unsure, rocks shifted, branches clawed at him. The lantern's flame flickered, barely holding on. For hours, he climbed in silence. At times, doubt whispered, "Why am I doing this? Am I lost? Will I ever reach the top?" But still, he walked. Just before dawn, breathless and aching, he reached the summit. The lantern went out. In the deep silence of that moment, Daichi looked out and saw nothing. Fog covered everything. There was no view, no sky, only stillness. He fell to his knees, not in defeat, but in surrender. He had come searching for clarity. Instead, he was given emptiness. And that was when it came in sight, not as light, but as space. He didn't need the view, he didn't need answers. He was the breath, he was the silence, he was the mountain. The climb hadn't led to revelation, it was the revelation. As the fog slowly lifted, just before sunrise, the valley appeared beneath him, soft, golden, alive. He didn't smile, he simply bowed. When Daichi returned to the monastery later that day, he said nothing. The abbot only looked at him and nodded. "You've seen what can't be shown." Moral of the story: the highest truths aren't found at the top, they're revealed in the step-by-step surrender of not knowing. The midnight climb is not to reach a peak, but to walk into the unknown with faith. Clarity often comes only after we've made peace with the fog. The next story is called Boy Melts Trauma Under Frozen Waterfall. In the northern mountains, where winter never truly ends, a narrow waterfall spilled down dark stone. For most of the year, it was frozen silent, unmoving, sharp as glass. The villagers called it the Still Cry, believing it held old sorrows, frozen in time. At the edge of the forest lived a boy named Akeno. He had not spoken in months. After surviving a fire that took his home and family, he walked through each day as if underwater. No words, no laughter, no tears, just silence. He was alive, but only just. One evening, the village elder brought him a thick robe and pointed to the mountain. "Go to the Still Cry," he said. "Stay until something breaks." The boy left before sunrise, climbing through wind and snow. When he reached the waterfall, it stood tall and harsh, an icy wall against the sky. He sat before it, breath shaking, unsure what to do. He closed his eyes and tried to remember his mother's voice, his father's hands. But nothing came. The cold sank deep into his skin. Hours passed. Still he sat. Then, something changed. Not in the ice, but in him. He heard a single drop of water fall. Then another. Then another. The ice was melting. Slowly, softly, the wall began to weep. Not in a rush, but in slow, steady tears. The boy looked up, and without meaning to, he cried. Not loudly. Just enough for warmth to return to his face. He touched his cheek, surprised. It had been so long since he'd felt that heat. He stepped beneath the falling water, letting it pour over him sharp, shocking, real. He did not scream. He simply stood, eyes closed, as the water carried something out of him. When he returned to the village that night, he still didn't speak, but he bowed to the elder and placed his small hands over his heart. The elder nodded. The still cry has moved. Moral of the story: healing doesn't always come through words. Sometimes, pain held too long must be met by something deeper than language, something that touches the body, the breath, the earth. Like ice melting into water, trauma softens not all at once, but one drop at a time when we are ready to feel again. The next story is called Fox Teaches Dharma Silently. In the forest beyond the monastery, where pine needles blanketed the earth and the wind carried secrets only stillness could hear, there lived a solitary fox. She was sleek, silent, and golden red like the last light of dusk. The monks spoke of her not with fear or folklore, but with respect. They said she appeared only to those whose minds had grown quiet enough to learn without words. A monk named Jun had spent years chasing understanding, reading sutras, memorizing chants, reciting teachings with perfect tone. Yet his heart still felt unsettled, as though he were always just outside the door of something deeper. The abbot, noticing his restlessness, said one morning, "Take no books, walk alone into the forest. If the fox comes, follow." Jun obeyed, uncertain. For hours he walked beneath the trees, trying to think of nothing. He listened to leaves rustling, his own breath, the heartbeat behind his ribs. Eventually, as the sun sank low, the forest grew quiet. Then, without sound, she appeared. The fox stood ahead on the path, unmoving. Her eyes met his, and something stilled inside him. She turned and walked. He followed not out of curiosity, but reverence. She led him through thick brush, along narrow paths, over a shallow stream where moonlight shimmered. She never looked back, never rushed. He stopped thinking about where they were going. He only followed the rhythm of her steps, the shape of the wind, the way the trees bowed as they passed. Finally, in a clearing lit by the stars, she lay down beneath a cedar and closed her eyes. Jun sat beside her and did the same. They rested there in silence, breathing together. No teachings were spoken, no questions asked. But something in him had shifted like a knot, loosened without a hand touching it. When he returned to the temple the next day, the abbot simply asked, "Did she say anything?" Jun smiled softly. "Everything." Moral of the story: not all Dharma comes in words. Sometimes the deepest truths are passed through presence, stillness, and shared space. When the mind stops demanding and the heart begins listening, even a silent fox can become a teacher. Wisdom is not always taught. Sometimes it's quietly remembered. The next story is called Statue Cries Every 70 Years. At the heart of a weathered temple hidden deep in the mountains stood a stone statue of Kannon, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Her face was carved with exquisite calm eyes, gently closed, hands folded in prayer. For generations, she stood unmoved through storms, earthquakes, and time itself. But there was a legend, whispered only by the temple's oldest caretakers. Once every 70 years, the statue weeps. Not from damage, not from rain, but from something within. just one tear, sliding down her cheek, glistening in the morning light before vanishing into her robe of stone. No one knew when it began. The last tear had been seen by a monk who was now long gone, his journal left behind in silence. As the 70th year approached again, the temple grew quiet with anticipation. Visitors came, hoping to witness the impossible, but the caretakers told them, "She doesn't cry for crowds. She cries when the world needs it most." One young monk named Ray, soft-spoken and unsure of his place, stayed behind after others left. He did not wait to see the tear. He waited to understand why it fell. Each morning, he swept the floor before her. Each evening, he bowed without asking. He watched how the light touched her stone hands at dusk, how the cold air curled around her still form. And day by day, Ray began to feel something rising in him, a sorrow he had hidden, not just his own, but the sorrow of many, the quiet weight of the world. Then, one morning, as the mist broke and the sun painted the room gold, Ray looked up. A single tear rested on the statue's cheek. It did not fall, it simply was. He bowed, pressing his forehead to the ground, not with joy or fear but with stillness. Something in him was seen, and in that tear the world felt less alone. Moral of the story: true compassion is timeless. It does not rush, it waits. Sometimes the universe answers not with noise, but with a single tear felt more than seen. In the still gaze of a statue, we are reminded, even what seems unfeeling may carry the deepest love, and when the time is right, it speaks without words. The next story is called Labyrinth Made of Silence. Beyond the hills of a windless plain, hidden inside a valley where even birds flew quietly, there stood a labyrinth not of stone, but of silence. It had no walls, no visible lines. To the eye, it was an open field, but those who entered found themselves walking paths they could not see, guided not by sight but by sound, or more precisely, the absence of it. The labyrinth was part of a sacred Zen retreat, known only to a few, passed down from master to student without ever being mapped. The rules were simple: walk without speaking, listen without seeking, and trust where silence leads. One novice named Hannah came to the retreat after years of struggling with meditation. Her thoughts raced, her body fidgeted, stillness felt like pressure. "How do I quiet the noise in me?" she asked the teacher. The teacher only replied, "Walk the labyrinth, let it teach." Hannah entered the field alone at dawn. At first, everything felt ordinary: grass underfoot, light wind. Her thoughts followed their usual rhythm: stories, new fears, impatience. But then she noticed something strange. Every time she turned left, the world grew quieter. Every time she turned right, a faint sound returned, rustling, a memory, her own breath loud again. She began to follow the silence. Each turn stripped something away: the need to understand, the urge to control, the name she called herself. With every quiet corner she passed, her body softened, her shoulders dropped, her thoughts lost their grip. There were no signs, no destination, just the stillness pulling her forward, not outward, but inward. At the center of the field, where even the wind held its breath, Hannah stopped. The silence there was not empty, was full of presence, of peace, of truth too delicate for words. She sat down, closed her eyes, and the silence sat with her. When she returned, her teacher said nothing, only bowed. Moral of the story: true silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of deep listening. We wander through our thoughts like a maze, but peace waits not at the end, only in the middle, where we stop trying to escape and begin to hear what has always been there. The next story is called Broken Instruments Used to Teach Truth. In a Zen monastery built beside a quiet river, The meditation hall was filled not with statues or scrolls but with broken instruments, cracked drums, snapped strings, shattered flutes. They lined the walls like forgotten voices. Visitors often stared in confusion, expecting music, only to find silence. One day, a new student named Maru arrived, full of energy and pride. He had studied music his whole life and believed he could learn Zen the same way through discipline, technique, and mastery. During his first week, he asked the teacher, "Where are the real instruments? I want to offer music to the Buddha." The teacher, an old man with kind eyes, handed Maru a wooden flute splintered down the middle. "This one," he said. Maru looked at it, insulted. "It doesn't work, it's broken." The teacher smiled. "So are most people." Still, Maru tried. For days, he sat beneath the trees, blowing gently through the ruined flute. The notes came out twisted, flat, sometimes just breath. He grew frustrated, angry, embarrassed. But over time, something shifted. He stopped trying to make music and began listening instead to the wind through the cracks, the rhythm of his breath, the silence between each broken note. The flute, in its damage, began to speak not in melody, but in truth. One morning, Maru played a soft tone that barely sounded like a note. The teacher stopped sweeping nearby and looked up. He bowed, as if hearing something sacred. Maru asked, "How can broken things still offer something beautiful?" The teacher replied, "Because truth does not need perfection to be heard." From that day on, Maru chose only the broken instruments, not to fix them, but to understand them. Through each flawed sound, he found clarity, humility, and peace. Moral of the story: wholeness is not a requirement for wisdom. Often, the most honest teachings come through the cracks. We are not asked to be flawless, we are asked to be real. And like broken instruments, our wounds may distort the sound, but they also deepen its meaning. Truth lives not in perfect harmony, but in sincere presence. The next story is called "Stone Disappears When Grasped." In a quiet Zen monastery by the river's bend, there was a small stone resting on the altar in the meditation hall. It was smooth, perfectly round, and pale gray, nothing extraordinary in appearance. But the monks called it Ishi no Kieta, the vanishing stone. Visitors often asked about it. The abbot would only say, "If you try to hold it, it will be gone." Many thought it was a riddle. Others thought it was some illusion. One young monk named Toma became obsessed. He was bright, eager, and still learning the difference between understanding with the mind and knowing with the heart. Late one night, alone in the hall, Toma reached out and picked up the stone. His hand closed around it light, cold, real. He smiled, triumphant. But as he held it tighter, the stone slipped. He grabbed again, firmer, and again it slid from his grasp, not falling, not rolling away, but simply gone. One moment there, the next nothing. Startled, he searched the floor, the altar, his sleeves. The stone had vanished. The next morning, the abbot placed the stone back on the altar without a word. It was there again, as if it had never left. Toma stared in disbelief. The abbot said quietly, "You can see it, you can sit beside it, you can honor it. But the moment you try to possess it, it disappears." Toma bowed deeply. The lesson cut deeper than words. He had not just lost a stone, he had witnessed the nature of the mind. From then on, he no longer reached for stillness. He sat with it. Moral of the story: peace cannot be held like an object. The more we try to grasp it, the more it slips away. Truth in Zen is not a thing to catch, but a presence to meet. Like the vanishing stone, clarity appears when we stop clenching and disappears when we try to own what was never meant to be kept. The next story is called Retreat starts by forgetting time. In the mountains where the clouds drifted slowly like wandering monks, there was a Zen retreat, so quiet it was said you could hear the grass grow. But what made it most unusual was this. Before entering, each participant was asked to surrender their time. No clocks, no bells, no schedules. Even the sun and stars were not to be watched with intent. The rule was clear. Forget what time it is, and you'll remember what presence feels like. A monk named Soma, known for her sharp mind and constant precision, arrived at the retreat carrying a small notebook where she tracked every hour of her day. She liked control, clarity, and measurable progress. The idea of giving up time unnerved her. "How will I know when to meditate, when to eat, when to sleep?" she asked. The teacher simply said, "You'll know if you stop asking." Soma hesitated, then placed her notebook in a basket at the gate, alongside watches, alarms, calendars, and phones left behind by others. At first, she was lost. The hours bled into each other like ink on wet paper. She found herself reaching for shadows on the wall, counting footsteps, seeking structure in the way her breath moved. But time, without numbers, became strange. It stretched and shrank like a dream. And then she stopped trying. She rose when she felt rested. She ate when her body whispered for food. She sat not for 20 minutes, but until the stillness inside her felt complete. In the absence of time, she began to notice more the way her heartbeat slowed during quiet, how light shifted on the floor, how presence deepened when it no longer had to race a clock. By the 5th day, she no longer wondered what time it was. She only wondered why she had ever needed to. When the retreat ended, and the teacher returned her notebook, Soma smiled, bowed, and placed it quietly back in the basket. Moral of the story: time can be useful, but it can also become a cage. When we forget the clock and return to natural rhythm, we remember that peace does not live in minutes, but in moments. True retreat begins when we stop counting and start being. The next story is called Zen Gate Unlocked with Laughter. At the edge of a sacred mountain path stood an old wooden gate known as Mumon, the Gateless Gate. It had no lock, no hinges, no visible barrier, yet no one could pass through unless they understood the lesson it guarded. Monks came and sat before it for days, weeks, even years, hoping for clarity. Some wept, some fasted, some meditated in deep silence, waiting for enlightenment to strike. The gate remained still. One day, a wandering monk named Riku arrived. He had no followers, no reputation. He carried only a walking stick and a torn robe. When he reached the gate, he did not sit. He simply looked at it, tilted his head and laughed. Not mockery, not arrogance, just full-bodied, free, joyful laughter, like a child seeing something wonderfully ridiculous for the first time. The monks nearby were shocked. One scolded him, "How dare you laugh at the gate?" But the old master who watched over the gate stood up, walked slowly to Riku, and with a bow opened his arms. "You may pass," he said. The other monks stared in confusion. What did he understand that we did not? The master smiled. He saw that the gate was never closed. Later, Riku explained nothing. He just said, "I spent years trying to push open what was never shut. I thought I needed answers, effort, perfection. But sometimes, when the mind stops trying to be wise, it becomes free." He bowed, not to the gate, but to the absurdity of chasing what was already here. Moral of the story: we often treat peace like a prize, awakening like a door locked by effort. But the truth is simpler and lighter. Laughter, honest and free, cuts through illusion faster than thought. When the grip on control loosens and the seriousness falls away, the mind opens. The greatest gates in Zen were never locked, only misunderstood. The next story is called Bell Heard Only by Those Who Listen Inward. At the center of a small forest temple stood an old bell, tower tall, weathered, and quiet. Travelers came from far and wide, hoping to hear the bell said to bring deep clarity. It was known as the inner bell, and its sound was rumored to awaken insight, calm sorrow, and return one to the present with a single note. But no one ever saw it ring. Some visitors waited for hours beneath the tower, ears sharp, hearts eager. Some struck the bell themselves, expecting echoes. It remained still, silent, cold. Then a wandering monk named Era arrived not to hear the bell, but to rest. She had no questions to ask, no expectations. Her mind was heavy with grief, but she carried it gently, like something already known. She bowed to the tower, then sat nearby. She did not wait. She closed her eyes, let her breath settle, and turned her attention inward. Each inhale softened her chest. Each exhale thinned the distance between thought and silence. Her focus became steady, deep, not reaching, just listening. And in that stillness, she heard it. A soft chimeno outside, but within, not in her ears, but in her chest, like a pulse of pure awareness. It rang once, then again. No vibration in the air, only a clear resonance inside her, gentle, steady, unmistakable. When she opened her eyes, nothing had changed. The bell stood unmoved. The forest was quiet. But something within her had settled, as if a door had opened to something long forgotten. The next morning, another monk asked, "Did you hear the bell?" She smiled and touched her heart. Yes, but not from the tower. Moral of the story: some sounds are not heard through the ears, but through presence. The most powerful bell is not the one outside, but the one that rings when the mind becomes still and the heart turns inward. Peace is not summoned by waiting for a signet, is revealed by listening deeply to what's already there. The next story is called Staring into Ink Until Mind Vanishes. In a dimly lit room at the back of an old Zen temple, there was a wooden desk with a single black inkstone placed at its center. No brush, no paper. Just the stone, flat, smooth, and stained with countless years of use. It was known as Kokuzai no Mi, the eye of emptiness. Only monks who had struggled with thought, those who clung too tightly to analysis, logic, and inner dialogue, were sent to sit with it. Not to write, not to think, only to stare. A monk named Seki, sharp-minded and endlessly curious, was one of them. He had memorized every koan, every sutra, every philosophical angle of Zen, but still he could not quiet his mind. His thoughts circled like birds that never landed. The abbot brought him to the room and said, "Look into the ink until it shows you what thought cannot." At first Seki scoffed. He sat, staring into the black surface, waiting for insight. His mind raced with interpretations. Was the ink symbolic? A mirror? A portal? Hours passed. Days passed. Each time he returned, he sat in silence, watching the black ink pool like still water. His questions eventually wore themselves out. His ideas collapsed under their own weight. Then one evening, something changed. He looked, and the ink no longer looked back. It was no longer an object. It was vast, depthless. It didn't reflect his face, his identity, or his search. It just was. And in that endless black, his thoughts dissolved one by one, until there was no more need to label, no urge to speak, only presence. The ink was not teaching him, it was undoing him. When Seki emerged, the abbot met him at the doorway. No words passed between them. Seki bowed, the first time from a place not of understanding, but of emptiness. Moral of the story: not all awakening comes through insight. Some comes when the self dissolves into what it cannot control. When we stop interpreting and simply observe, the mind lets go of its edges. The black ink holds no answer, only a mirror for what disappears when we stop needing to be someone at all. The next story is called Mirror Reflects Thoughts, Not Features. In a temple tucked between misty hills and winding rivers, there was a room that few monks entered without guidance. At its center stood an unusual mirror round, clouded and framed in dark cedar. It didn't shine like glass, nor show clear images. It was known simply as the Mirror of Mind. Legend said the mirror did not reflect your face, but your thoughts. When a young monk named Nami, full of questions and frustration, came to the abbot seeking clarity, he said, "I sit every day, but I still can't find peace. My mind is loud, scattered. I don't know who I am in the silence." The abbot nodded and led her to the room. "Stand before the mirror," he said, "and look. Don't fix your posture, don't smile, just be still. It will show you what needs to be seen." Nami stepped forward. At first, she saw nothing, only a dull blur. But slowly, as she gazed without expectation, shapes began to shift. Not her eyes or hair or skin, but images, flashes. A swirl of worry, a burst of impatience, a tight knot of doubt. Thoughts rose like smoke, visible not as words, but as weight and color. She stepped back, shaken. "It's showing my mind." The abbot said gently, "What you see is what you carry. The mirror only reveals what is already within." Day by day, Nami returned. She watched her reflection change, not because the mirror altered, but because she did. As her practice deepened, the storm within her softened. She began to notice stillness behind the images, space behind the thoughts. One day, she stood before the mirror and saw only light soft, open like dawn. She smiled, not at her face, but at the quiet. Moral of the story: we often search outside for who we are, but the clearest reflections lie within. When the mind quiets, we stop seeing shadows and start recognizing presence. A true mirror doesn't show what we look like, it shows what we think like. And when we meet that reflection without judgment, peace begins to form. The next story is called Cave Where Silence Speaks. Far beyond the village roads, past forests and forgotten shrines, there was a cave carved into the side of a mountain, its entrance hidden by vines and time. The monks called it Shizukana Iwa, the silent stone, and spoke of it with a reverence that needed no explanation. It was said that those who entered the cave with a quiet mind would hear something not from the world, but from within themselves. No teachings were given there, no rituals. The only instruction: enter alone and listen. A monk named Kaoru, burdened by grief after the death of his teacher, came to the cave seeking comfort. He had studied Zen for years, but found that no verse or chant could quiet the ache in his chest. Words, once sacred, now felt thin. He longed not for answers, but for something real. He entered the cave at dusk, carrying only a small candle. The air inside was cool and damp, the stone walls curving like the ribs of the earth itself. After walking deep enough, the light revealed nothing but silence. Kaoru sat. At first, there was only the hum of stillness, then his own breath, the sound of his heartbeat. His thoughts, still loud and restless, flickered like the candle, but the cave did not echo. It swallowed every sound, every whisper, every sorrow. It listened better than he ever could. Hours passed. His mind tired. He wept softly. The silence held him. Then, as the candle burned low, he heard it not with his ears, but as a soft knowing in the space behind thought. Not a voice, not a message, just peace. A presence so complete it needed no shape, no name. It did not speak to comfort him, it spoke by being. And in that presence, his grief began to breathe. When Kaoru returned to the temple the next morning, he said nothing. But those who saw him noticed the grief was not gone, but it had softened into stillness. Moral of the story: silence is not empty. It holds truths that language cannot reach. When we sit in stillness long enough, the world stops speaking and the heart begins. There are places where peace does not answer our questions. It gently removes the need to ask. The next story is called Graveyard Meditation to Hear Regrets. At the edge of a forest, just beyond the temple walls, there was an old graveyard where time had softened the stones and moss had claimed the names. Few monks dared to go there after dark, not because of ghosts, but because of what the silence whispered. Still, it was tradition that every monk nearing the end of their first year would spend one night meditating among the graves, not to overcome fear but to listen. When it came time for a young monk named Kaoru to go, she was uneasy. She had read the teachings, memorized the chants, and practiced stillness every day. But the idea of sitting among the dead made her heart race. "What am I supposed to find there?" she asked. The master simply said, "Not what, who." So, at dusk, Kaoru carried a small mat and a single candle into the graveyard. She found a quiet spot between two ancient stones, both names nearly faded, and sat. The candle flickered. The wind moved gently through the trees. The earth smelled of age and endings. At first, her thoughts circled. What if she failed? What if she heard nothing? What if something beyond the body was listening too? But slowly, as the night deepened, the silence thickened. And from within that silence came voices. Not from the air, but from within her own chest. Regrets, not hearses. Lives once lived, words never said, apologies never given, moments wasted in anger or fear. They came as whispers, not to haunt, but to remind. I waited too long. I never forgave her. I was always afraid. I wanted to say I loved them, but didn't. Each regret echoed like a bell without sound. Kaoru's tears fell freely. She didn't know these people, but she recognized them. The ache was universal, human. Her own heart echoed back, "I understand." By sunrise, the candle had gone out, but a warmth remained. She bowed to the stones, not in fear, but in gratitude. Moral of the story: the dead have no voices, yet their lessons speak louder than words. When we sit with endings, we hear what truly matters. Regret is a teacher, not meant to shame, but to wake. In the stillness of what's gone, we remember how to live while we still can. The next story is called Floors Burned on Rice Paper. At a small Zen temple near the edge of a slow-moving river, there was a yearly ritual kept quiet from the outside world. It was not grand, not spoken of with pride, and yet it was one of the most sacred acts the monks performed. They called it Kesho no Hai, the fire of seeing. Each monk, once a year, would sit alone with a sheet of rice paper, a brush, and their full honesty. On the delicate surface, they were to write their flaws, not the ones others could see, but the ones buried in silence: envy, guilt, pride, fear, shame. It was not a list to be judged, it was a mirror to be faced. One winter, a monk named Nari was chosen to begin. She had always been kind, graceful in her practice, respected for her composure, but inside she carried a quiet weight. Perfection had become her mask. She feared being seen broken, uncertain, human. As she dipped her brush into ink, her hand trembled. She stared at the blank page for hours. The first word she wrote was fear, then resentment, then need to be praised. One by one, she let the truth rise ugly, sharp, vulnerable. When the page was filled, she carried it to the fire. She bowed, held it to the flame, and watched. The paper curled in the heat, ink melting into smoke. Her flaws did not scream. They did not cling. They simply rose, turned to ash, and vanished into the cold night air. She did not feel cured. She felt clear. The next morning, her presence was different. Not lighter, not heavier, but more real. The other monks did not ask what she had written. They only bowed, knowing that the hardest truths are those spoken to no one, and finally released. Moral of the story: healing begins when we stop hiding from what's already within us. The flaws we fear to admit lose their weight when held in honest hands. Burning them is not destruction, it is offering. In facing what we are, without shame, we make space for who we've always been beneath the fear. The next story is called Ink Fades as Mind Stills. In a temple known for its calligraphy hall, where the walls were lined with scrolls of ancient Zen verses, there was a single piece of parchment displayed in a quiet alcove. It was not grand or ornate, just a short line of black ink written in a gentle hand. But unlike the others, this scroll was different. Its ink faded slowly over time. Every few weeks, the words became lighter, as though dissolving into air. Visitors often asked why no one rewrote it. The monks only smiled and replied, "The message fades when it is understood." One day, a monk named Kaito-young, restless, always chasing the next answer, stood before the scroll and stared. The line read, "Still the mind, and the words will disappear." He scoffed quietly. "That's not possible. Words stay." But something in him was curious. He returned the next day, then again the next. At first, he stared only to solve it, to make sense of the trick. But the ink remained, soft but steady. Then something changed. He began to sit longer. He stopped analyzing. He started breathing with the quiet room. Each day, as his thoughts slowed, the ink grew lighter. After weeks, only a faint shadow of the line remained. It was then the head monk came to him and said, "The ink does not vanish from air, it vanishes from you." Kaito's eyes filled, not with confusion but recognition. The fading was not a trick, it was a mirror. When his thoughts were loud, the words stayed. When he surrendered to silence, they disappeared. Not because they were gone, but because he no longer needed them. The next day, the scroll was blank. And for the first time, so was Kaito's mind. Moral of the story: true understanding is not about remembering, it's about releasing. Words are tools, not truths. When the mind becomes still enough, even teachings fall away. Not in forgetting, but in becoming. The ink fades not because it's lost, but because it's no longer needed to guide the one who is finally present. The next story is called Monk Fasts from Sound for 7 Years. At a temple tucked deep within snow-covered hills, there lived a monk named Jiro, known not for his words but for the absence of them. On his 30th birthday, he made a vow that puzzled even the elders. "For 7 years, I will not hear a single sound." He built a small hut far from the temple grounds, beyond the sound of bells, chants, and footsteps. There, he sealed his ears with cotton and beeswax. He did not speak. He did not listen. He entered a world stripped of sound, where silence became not just a practice but his only companion. Many believed he would go mad, but he did not. At first, the silence was loud. His thoughts screamed, memories surfaced, regrets replayed like distant thunder. He could hear, inside his own mind, every doubt he had buried, but he stayed. The days turned to months. The seasons came and went. In the 4th year, he no longer missed music or voices or wind in the trees. He began to see sound in the movement of leaves, in the way people's mouths curved when they spoke, in the vibration of temple bells he could not hear, but felt in the earth beneath his feet. In the 6th year, even thoughts stopped clinging. His mind became a sky, his breath the only rhythm he needed. And in the 7th year, He woke one morning to find a tear sliding down his cheek, not from sorrow, but from something deeper, gratitude. Without sound, he had heard the world more clearly than ever before. When he returned to the temple, the monks gathered. They expected a profound speech, a lesson carved from silence. Jiro bowed, smiled gently, and whispered just 3 words. Silence never left. Then he said no more. Moral of the story: silence is not the absence of sound, it is the absence of noise within. When we stop chasing noise to feel alive, we uncover a deeper rhythm. Stillness speaks not in words, but in presence. And when we truly listen within, even silence becomes a sacred sound. The next story is called Bow to Your Shadow at Dawn. At a hilltop temple where the morning sun rose like a silent bell, the monks practiced a strange and private ritual. Each day at first light, they turned to face their own shadow and bowed. No one explained it in lectures. It was not written in any sutra, but every monk, young and old, knew its meaning by heart. The ritual was not for the sun, nor for the posture. It was for the part of themselves they often tried to avoid. A novice named Ray struggled with this. She bowed to the Buddha, to her teachers, even to the wind, but when she stood before her shadow, she hesitated. Her mind filled with judgments, memories of anger, impatience, shame. "Why bow to this part of me?" she once asked. The elder monk replied, "Because it follows you everywhere, even when you pretend it isn't there." The next morning, Ray stood alone on the temple's eastern edge. The sun climbed slowly over the horizon. Her shadow stretched long before her, dark, quiet, complete. It moved as she moved. It offered no resistance. It simply was. She felt her chest tighten. Tears welled, unexpected. She bowed deeply, slowly, fully, not to erase the shadow, but to acknowledge it, to say, "I see you. You belong." In that bow, something inside softened. The shame didn't vanish, but it changed. It became part of her, held, not hidden. From that day on, Ray never missed the dawn ritual. She no longer feared her shadow. It had become a teacher. Moral of the story: true peace doesn't come from escaping who we've been, but from bowing to all that we are. The shadow is not an enemy, it's the echo of our own light. When we meet it with humility instead of fear, healing begins. The self we avoid is the one still waiting to be seen and accepted. The next story is called Fears Whispered into Bamboo at Dusk. In a valley surrounded by groves of tall bamboo, a Zen temple stood in soft silence. The wind moved gently through the stalks, making them sing like distant flutes. The monks who lived there believed the bamboo could carry prayers not upward to the sky, but inward to the heart. Each evening at dusk, just before night took the land, the monks practiced a sacred ritual. Kowai Ko, the voice of fear. One by one, they would walk into the grove, choose a stalk of bamboo, lean close, and whisper their deepest fear into the hollow. There was no response, no fire, no miracle, only the soft sound of the wind and the space to let go. A young monk named Shun resisted this ritual. "If I name my fear," he once said, "won't it grow stronger?" The abbot shook his head. "No. What grows stronger is what you refuse to face." So one evening, just as the sky turned the color of cooled ash, Shun entered the bamboo grove alone. The wind was still, the air heavy with stillness. He knelt beside a tall green stalk and closed his eyes. His lips trembled. "I'm afraid I'll never be enough," he whispered. "Afraid I will live unseen, that I will die with parts of me still unloved." He pressed his forehead gently to the stalk. There was no echo, no answer, only the soft creaking of bamboo in the breeze, as if it had heard then carried the words away. Shun sat in the grove until the stars blinked awake. Something in his chest had loosened. not vanished, but no longer hidden. From that night forward, he returned again and again, not to get rid of fear, but to befriend it. Each whisper made space. Each breath returned him to stillness. Moral of the story: fear does not disappear when ignored, it softens, when spoken, gently and without judgment. When we bring our fears into the open, they lose their shape. Like wind through bamboo, they move, they pass. Peace isn't found by fighting fear, but by making room for it and watching it fade into the dusk. The next story is called Hut Where Names Are Forgotten. Deep in the forest, where light moved gently between tall cedars and moss softened every step, there stood a small hut made of stone and wood. There were no signs, no path led directly to it. Only those who wandered long enough and quietly ever found it. The monks called it Bomushitsu, the nameless room. It was said that anyone who stayed in the hut for a full moon cycle would forget their namano in confusion, but in freedom. Forget who they had been, what they had carried, who they were supposed to become. Only the breath would remain, only the present. A monk named Rina, known for her sharp mind and sharp sorrow, asked the abbot if she could go. She had spent years trying to let go of titles, of pain, of an identity shaped by grief. But the more she tried, the more she clung. The abbot placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "When the name fades, what remains is truth." Rina entered the hut on the night of the new moon. Inside, there was nothing, no mirror, no books, no candle, no voice but the one in her mind. At first, her thoughts screamed for recognition. They repeated her name like a drumbeat. She remembered her childhood, her mistakes, the way others had praised her, blamed her, called her by name. But the hut gave her nothing to echo those thoughts. No one called, no one replied. There was only silence and trees. As the days passed, the name in her mind began to lose its shape. It softened like mist until it no longer felt like hers. She sat, breathed, ate in silence, and slowly something opened. A life without story, a self without label. When the moon became full, she stepped outside. The forest looked the same, but she did not. The abbot saw her return and bowed deeply. He did not speak her name. She had no need to be reminded. Moral of the story: names are useful in the world, but not in the soul. The self beneath the name is quieter, freer, and always whole. When we forget who we think we are, we remember what we truly are: presence without title, being without boundary. The next story is called Wind-Brewed Tea Silences the Heart. High in a temple perched along a cliff where the wind spoke louder than the birds, there was a tea master named Sayo, known not for the leaves she used, but for how she brewed them. She made no fire, boiled no water. Her tea was called Kaze no Chawin tea. Visitors thought it a myth. "How can tea be brewed without heat?" they asked. The monks only smiled and said, "Her water is the wind, her flame is patience." When a tired traveler named Akio arrived, his mind cluttered with grief, his chest tight with unspoken sorrow, he was told to see Sayo. He expected advice. Instead, she handed him an empty cup and led him to a quiet stone bench overlooking the valley. The wind rushed through the pines like breath through a flute. She placed a single tea leaf into his cup, then simply sat, said nothing, closed her eyes. Akio waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. The wind circled them gently. The leaf moved in his cup, spinning, pausing, dancing. There was no scent of boiling, no comfort of warmth, just presence. At first, Akio felt frustrated, then still, then something unfamiliar: peace. The leaf, once dry, had softened. The cup, though cool, felt full, and inside him, the ache that once pressed hard against his ribs had quieted, not solved, not erased, but silenced the way a song softens into echo. He looked at Sayo and asked softly, "Is this tea?" She opened her eyes and smiled. "Only if you're willing to drink what can't be tasted." He raised the cup. It was cool, empty, yet he bowed deeply. From that day on, Akio no longer rushed to speak or fix. When pain visited, he sat by the wind and listened. He learned that healing sometimes brews in silence, and that the heart, like a leaf, opens when given still air and time. Moral of the story: not all medicine comes with warmth or words. Some healing is steeped in stillness. Like wind-brewed tea, peace does not shout, it arrives gently, when nothing is forced. When we let go of needing comfort, we begin to feel calm. When we stop stirring, the heart finally settles. The next story is called Leaves Fall Upward in a Sweep. In a valley where autumn came early and stayed long, the temple grounds were blanketed in golden leaves for weeks. Every morning, the monks would sweep them into soft pillars, an act, not of cleaning, but of devotion. The abbot once said, "We do not sweep to remove the leaves, we sweep to see ourselves." But one autumn, something strange began to happen. A young monk named Soma, quiet and observant, noticed it first. As he swept the courtyard alone in the early light, a sudden breeze passed, not fierce, not wild, but lifting. The leaves, instead of falling downward, rose. Not all at once, not like a storm, but gently, as if remembering something they had forgotten. They rose in slow spirals, then floated upward toward the morning sky. Soma stood motionless, broom in hand, watching what could not be explained. The others didn't believe him until it happened again. Each time Soma swept with presence, not purpose, the same thing occurred. If he rushed, nothing happened. If he swept to clear, the leaves stayed grounded. But when he moved slowly, listening, allowing, then the leaves would lift, as if carried by the breath of the earth itself. One evening, the abbot approached and watched Soma sweeping in silence. The leaves rose again, glowing in the light of the setting sun. Not one monk spoke. It was not a miracle. It was a teaching. The abbot whispered, "It is not the leaves that change. It is the one holding the broom." From that day on, sweeping became more than a task. It became a sacred momentous surrender, not to order, but to wonder. Moral of the story: when we move without control, without force, life responds with grace. The world becomes light when the mind becomes light. We do not need to chase magic only to become quiet enough for it to find us. Even the ordinary, like fallen leaves, will rise when met with stillness. In just 3 hours, we've traveled through silent caves, echoing bird calls, upside-down breaths, and temples that vanish when described. We've met monks who bow away their burdens, foxes who teach without a word, and broken bowls that hold the light. Each story, quiet as a falling leaf, offers a gentle reminder. Clarity is not something to find, it is something to remember. Emotional serenity does not come from escaping life, but from being fully present with it. Whether you are sweeping the courtyard or listening to the rain, the path is always here, right beneath your feet. If one story stirred something in you, made you pause, breathe deeper, or even smile, share it in the comments. What did you feel? What did you remember? Let your voice become part of the stillness we carry together. And if you'd like more moments like this, more quiet teachings, more soul-softening stories, subscribe to the channel. Let this space be your temple wherever you are. Until next time, breathe, bow, and be.